6A.
What page does that start with?
And it starts with page 312. But we're going to go to page 354. And I'm going to tell you why. So,
Oh, we're going to 354.
yes. So, item 6A, so we're now starting our review of the Pathways to Licensure. I'd say maybe our final review of the Pathways to Licensure. And this 6A is what we actually just voted on, which was the consolidation of all the categories of trainees. And so, and there were two proposals. One was putting all the categories into one, that was that proposal. And that's essentially Pathways Proposal A, or it's number A on 6A. And then 6B was if we, was rolling them all into one category except for registered psychologists, and we were going to change the name of that to psychological associates as recommended by our stakeholder meeting. But now we've just voted to keep the categories except for rolling registered psychologists into psychological assistants. So rather than kind of going through this, and really we're talking about everything that's highlighted in yellow. So for the rest of going through pathways, that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at the yellow parts. But since we just voted on this and we voted differently from either one of these, Proposal A or Proposal B, what I'd like to suggest is that we have staff just go through all our pathways and eliminate wherever registered psychologist is. And if there's any place that needs to be rolled in, so when we talk about the different categories, that would be one of the categories, for them to just go ahead and do that, and then we don't have to go through this part. Okay. Well, I can't see it there, but I can see it there.
Do you want to have the conversation about psychological associates now?
It might be a good idea to have that conversation now.
I can get it started.
Okay.
I mean, I don't really care that much, except that one of the things that I've noted with people that used to come to me for consultations before I was on the board about their business cards as psychological assistants is people tried to make it sound like they weren't a psychological assistant. So they would put so-and-so psychological assistant number in association with blank, 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 and never put that was their supervisor. So they made it sound like they're practicing with somebody else. They're both practicing together. So I think if we do go over to psychological associate, we do need to be very careful to make sure that people still understand that they have to specify who their supervisor is and that they're working under supervision. If we do that, I don't have any objection to the change in terminology. And maybe it sounds more dignified. It doesn't necessarily to my ear, but hey, whatever. It seems like people like it. But I do think that there is a lesson that is was implicit for me when I was a psychological assistant, and that was for me to recognize this was another step of my pathway to licensure, and that no, I wasn't a psychologist yet, and I didn't get to pretend I was a psychologist yet, that in reality, I was something less than a psychologist, but I was on my way to becoming a psychologist. And I don't know that 10 years from now, when people call themselves psychological associates, they're not going to be complaining about the same thing they complain about the term psychological assistant. It feels demeaning, it feels this, it feels that. The truth of the matter is, it's a lesser category for licensing. So I just want to be really clear about that, but I'm not going to be a roadblock if there's a strong consensus about psychological associates.
Dr. Horn, you were right earlier. That discussion that Solid had was about psychology associate was around the registered psychologist.
Okay.
So I just wanted to point that out. And though I do think, and this is page 410 of 533, that it does still offer insight to the discussion in terms of the terms being used. It looks like it was apparently to some seen as a confusing term, and there was a favored choice, it looks like, of the notion of pre-licensed psychologists. So I'm putting these out there as not as suggestions or motions, but just going through and for discussion purposes. Folks in NorCal preferred the title psychology associate, but they did so because the word psychologist wasn't included in that, so there was no confusion. There were folks who did obviously support the moving it into the psychological assistant title. So it seems like from that discussion, the word associate wasn't necessarily always favored, even in the case of the registered psychologist context. I wonder to what extent that changes in the psychological assistant context.
I don't think folks were actually talking about the same thing, and so, I don't think this question was before them. I tend to agree with you, Dr. Phillips. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think, it's like somebody putting PhD in real little, putting candidate. It's very misleading. People do that. I think that's, and so anybody who comes and shows you their business card and it says in association with or something like that, they're also misrepresenting who they are and their status and all like that. I tend to agree with you. I don't think the word, any category that, I think psychology associate is fine. I think I think associate sounds a little better. I think psychological associate is fine. And it's just a preference. I don't think it makes any difference. I think they're both, they would be signifying this person is not a psychologist, this person is in a training category. Then we're talking about individuals. But I'm, if the public kind of wants this, or people think this sounds a bit more professional and more in line with the training or whatever that psychologists have had, I see no reason to block that. I think, or vote against it. I think that we'll make it clear in our, things that we hand out and things that the public sees and things that we put on our website, that it's a training category. That's my thought.
Quick question. For Breeze purposes, is that a pretty easy change in the system to change the category, or is that going to be a potential challenge?
With Breeze, we go by numbers. So each category, like for example, PSY is 6,001. Psychological assistance is 6,002s, and registered psychologist is 6,003s. And we could, it wouldn't be difficult to change the name. So in Breeze, when we have the drop-down tables, it would say 6,002 psychological assistant. If you want to change that to associate, it would be pretty easy to do.
Though I would think for historical purposes, we wouldn't want to get rid of the psychological assistant category because we want to track who was psychological assistants in the past. So I think we'd have to add a number, like 6,004. But then you've got a problem of converting some people over from the 6,002 to 6,004 category.
Currently, 6,004 is already taken.
Oh, well, whatever the number would be.
It would be
I'm just using that as an example. 6,000X.
We can do that. We can do that. It's just, yeah.
I think what we need to do is think about what we want to do and what's the appropriate thing to do, and then, really have them work with the Breeze system and ask for those changes. I don't want to make it rough, but...
If you're just changing the name, that's simple. If you want to add another category, that's a heavy lift.
Well, and the reason I say that is because we've lost a lot of historical data when we moved over to Breeze, because we didn't have access to the older system, or it was more limited access to the older system, and Breeze didn't necessarily track the same things. So I don't want to lose the people they were never a psychological associate. They were always a psychological assistant. They've been licensed now, but that's part of the history of how they became licensed. They may decide to be licensed in another state, want to show proof of that. So I don't think we want that historical data to be lost in the process of creating the new category, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
So is that possible then?
Anything is possible.
Okay. I mean, that's actually kind of what I think. I mean, we don't want to make it too hard, but I sure don't want Breeze to be the reason why we don't do something that we think is the right thing to do or the appropriate thing to do. So, I'm sorry.
Just a quick question, and I'll take inspiration from attending the ASPBB meeting. In making this change, keeping in mind that, there's going to be statutory and regulatory changes that will accompany this, helping to understand from a staff perspective, what is the why and what is the problem we're trying to fix with changing the name?
That's a good point.
I just want to put that out there for discussion.
That's a great point.
I'm not the one to ask.
We could ask Dr. Winkleman. Because it's purely from me, it's not, in terms of thinking, they're both training categories, so it's just what sounds better, Dr. Winkleman?
Elizabeth Winkleman, California Psychological Association again. So I brought it up because I noticed it in the comments that you received and realized that there was that recent change in the master's level that the MFTs trainees be called.
Yeah, that's good.
Thanks. So I raised it because I noticed that in the public comments, and because I know there was a recent change in the master's level from the Board of Behavioral Sciences for the MFTs to be called associates instead of interns. And then I just checked, and all the LCSW, LPCC, and MFT trainees are all called associates now. So I guess I think that associate sounds more dignified and more trained than assistant. I don't think it's a gigantic issue, but I do think it sounds more dignified and at a higher level. And so I thought it's something worth considering, since the people that have less training are using that title in their trainees, and psychologists are not.
So let me take a whack at this. It would be more commensurate with the training and responsibilities associated with the training category?
Yes, that's a good summary, yes.
Is that a good why? Thank you, Dr. Winkle. So what do y'all think?
I like psychological associate, since it doesn't change the nomenclature as much. As opposed to psychology associate, sounds a little awkward to me. So if we're going to do it, I would say psychological associate.
I went through the survey just now with a Control F associate, just to see how many comments were that. I counted 3 out of a total of, I think, 1,800 responses we received. So I'm not sure that survey in itself, for me, is compelling enough for us to go down this path. And I'm not suggesting we go through another survey, but I think I'm just thinking about how responsive we are being in that context to the number of respondents who raised that. And that's where I'm going with that.
I think, and Dr. Winkleman could probably weigh in on this as well, I think it's been a consistent complaint by people in that category since at least the time I was getting trained. So even though the survey may not have it a lot of times, it's something we hear about a lot.
And again, it wasn't asked in the survey or addressed in the survey. I will tell you that across the United States, psychological associate is the name used for the category of people in training that boards are, that register with the board and stuff like that aren't informal internships or things like that. So that's what that level, pre-licensed level, is called across the other jurisdictions.
Ms. Sork, does that,
That's helpful.
okay, that's perfect. Then if that's the case,
Okay, it's pretty consistent. Associate is the last word. I don't know what the first word is. So, do we have to have a motion on that then? Because it does sound like that, then we're going through changing stuff. Okay. All right.
I make a motion that the training category called psychological assistant be renamed as psychological associate.
and I'm seconding that.
Okay, so it's been moved and seconded that we change the category name, psychological assistant, to psychological associate. Is there any more board discussion about that?
I do think when we bring it to the board that we also encourage our stakeholders who might be listening in and are in attendance today to also submit comments to that or participate in that board hearing in public comment in some way, so that we are following this historical.
Let us know in the board meeting
Right.
their support for that. And
Yes, absolutely.
yeah, that's really, thank you for saying that. Good idea. Any public comment on that? Yeah. Yeah.
So I was looking at the California Code of Regulations and the registered psychologist. That is someone with a postdoctoral degree, that is with a doctorate, and in a postdoctoral condition, in opposed to a pre-doc. And the psychological assistant includes both. Is that correct?
Correct.
So in changing, I'm thinking this is stream of consciousness, and please break into my stream if you want to. So that means that we have still both categories, pre-doctoral people and postdoctoral people in the same category. So we're not delineating the one from the other. We're just renaming the category. Is that correct?
Right.
And the registered psychologist is going away and will become part of this category, psychological associate.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any more public comment about this? All right, seeing none. Mr. Glass-Steagall.
Fu,
Aye.
Horn,
Aye.
Phillips,
Aye.
motion passes.
Okay. That's great. Thank you. So we're going to be bringing that to the board. All right, now, where are we going? Y'all tell me where to go.
I do want to acknowledge how much staff time went into to marking up these regulations, anticipating these changes that no longer are going to occur.
Thank you so much.
On page, 355 of 533, this comment had come up before, and we just wanted to clarify when the committee had discussed standardizing the number of hours of training for the pre-licensure coursework requirements, that was a general provision about child, elder, and dependent adult abuse assessment and reporting training that impacted not only our board but other boards. The current language is the 7 contact hours, and staff had changed all the pre-licensure coursework requirements to the 6 hours. But the comment we put out for consideration in the committee is because this impacts other programs, would the committee consider keeping that at the 7 contact hours and not making any changes there before you move on to the next highlighted area?
Well, the rationale is in a typical day of continuing education, you get 6, maybe 6.5 hours of continuing
6.
education.
Pretty typical.
You never get 7. So it's going to require a 2-part course as opposed to being able to take it, knock it all out in one day. I wonder if we went to the other boards and said, do you care, whether they would.
I agree with you. I mean, I think, again, it's a typically very, very common, I mean, I can't even think on one hand how that there's ever been, that the continuing education a full day is 6 hours. 3 hours in the morning, hour for lunch, 3 hours in the afternoon, very typically.
Ms. Chung, how is this coursework requirement being met currently with the 7-hour requirement? How are applicants showing proof of completion of the 7?
Usually, they will submit like a course certificate to us, and then that course will label exactly how many hours that they took. That's one way.
So these are probably special courses just for this, to meet this requirement. I mean, all CE, you get a certificate of completion, and it all says a number of hours, and so people are doing 7 hours for this. But we do want to be consistent, if at all possible, and what do we have to do to ask other boards about?
Just looking at, for example, our current legislative proposal to change the professional therapy never includes sex
Yeah.
brochure. We are sponsoring a bill. It is a general provision, 2 general provision changes that impact not only our board, but the other boards. During that process, our board sought input from the other boards. So we could do something similar to talk about this requirement.
So, and then they had to each take it back to their board to get approval, if I recall correctly.
They did that for the actual brochure.
Right.
For the language in the statute, they're just soliciting a support position for the board's bill, which is actually going on in a hearing today.
Right now,
Dr.
probably.
Erickson is testifying today.
So I guess what you're saying to us is it's going to be a very time-consuming process?
I just want the committee to be fully prepared for the discussion of sitting before the legislature and explaining why 6 and not 7, and certainly saying that typically a continuing education course is 6.5 or 6 hours. That's something that we can certainly explain, but just wanting to fully prepare the board to have that discussion before the legislature to say that 1 less hour is unnecessary in this training category. I just want you to be fully prepared for that.
And we want to be consistent.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another thing too. We want to be consistent with what the requirements are. And, I mean, both of those are reasons. And
Wait, is this the type of thing that might go in the omnibus bill? If everybody signed off on it?
I'm not sure. We can always present it as an omnibus proposal with input from the other boards, and we are happy to engage in that process if that's what the committee would like to do.
I'm sensitive to the comments we've received over the last few board hearings, and as well as the recent sunset hearing during public comment, and I just would not be comfortable going, even though I understand that things are designed in a 6-hour block. I think even though there's a practical element to making it 6, I am concerned about the message that might be sent even though it's a practical reason, just given the times we're in. So I would,
What concern, I'm sorry, so I'm missing what concerns, what comments, what concerns?
the comments we've heard over child custody cases and what looks like what hasn't been reported, and this is, if I'm reading it right in the language, it is under the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, CE. So, it's no longer CE, sorry, I apologize for that. And so I think, and to Ms. Horwick's point about going before the legislature and talking about this and just the comments that they've received as well, I'm not sure it sends the right message at that time, given where it's located under. So I would recommend keeping it to the 7, and hopefully folks who prepare courses will meet that standard and think through that when they make that offering.
Well, I'm sure they do meet that standard if that's the requirement, so. Yeah, I can hear your concerns. It is just one out of all of them and all like that, so.
And I would just think about it from a legislator's point of view, where they're most concerned about preventing child abuse, where we're just doing it because we want to make our hours uniform, have a uniform system. I'm not sure they'd find that a very persuasive countervailing reason. So it might put us in an awkward position trying to justify this, particularly given recent comments during child custody hearings that we do not take the well-being of children seriously enough, which I think is incorrect. But I think we as a profession and we as a board certainly take it very seriously. Might be worth considering having one irregular requirement.
Hey, I go with what y'all think, so. We're going to leave it. We'll leave it. Thank you. Okay. Is there any public comment about this? I shouldn't say we're going to leave it and not ask for public comment. Okay, so we're going to leave it as it is. All right, so it looks like, where do we go next? Can you?
So the next area that at the last licensing committee, at the last full licensing committee meeting, the committee asked for us to look at 2909 and 2910 and to look at revising it and making it more clear. Right now it's talking about exempt people and then exempt settings and how that language is different. So staff took a stab at it, and it's on page 358 of 533. And so we just rolled it all into, 359, sorry, of 533 is the new 2910. And then 2909.5, you can go through because that deals with registered psychologist category, which we've talked about doing a global change on.
Right, right. Just psychological associates, right?
To eliminate the registered psychologist category.
Right.
So you can skip 2909.5 and go straight to 2910 for consideration.
I think we should recognize we are making a sea change for those institutions that do have registered psychologists. We're broadening the category in some respects. There will be an expense attendant to it. And they will be subject to additional requirements vis-a-vis supervision, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure do registered psychologists have the same supervision requirements? limit of 3 registered psychologists per licensed psychologist. So that may be impactful in some ways. Basically, what we're doing is just obliterating that whole category and saying if you want to have these people, you'll need to go to psychological assistant. So it will be interesting to see what kind of feedback we get on this.
Okay, so let's look at 359, page 359, 2910. This is what staff has recommended, and essentially it combines both the exempt setting and who's working there, which we've asked them to do, and what do y'all think?
It would actually help me if Mr. Glassbeagle read this out loud.
Okay.
So 2910 is currently existing language, you just want it read aloud?
2910 on page 350, top of page 359.
Okay.
If you could read it out loud.
Sure. So 2910, applicability of Chapter to practice psychology by certain salaried employees of academic institutions, public schools, or governmental agencies. This chapter shall not be construed to restrict the practice of psychology on the part of persons who are salaried employees of accredited or approved academic institutions, public schools, or governmental agencies, if those employees are complying with the following. 1. Performing those psychological activities as part of the duties for which they were hired. 2. Performing those activities solely within the jurisdiction or confines of those organizations. 3. Do not hold themselves out to the public by any title or description of activities incorporating the words psychology, psychological, or psychologist. 4. Are primarily gaining the supervised professional experience required for licensure that is being accrued consistent with the board's regulations, and the employees have as the primary supervisor a psychologist licensed in the state. B. Commencing January 1, 2016, an individual employed or who becomes employed by one or more employers as described in Subdivision A shall be exempt under this section for a cumulative total of 5 years.
Thank you.
So just to give a little background, at the last committee meeting when the committee talked about the sections of 2909 and 2910 being confusing, Ms. Chung, Ms. Lim, and myself, we looked at the language, and what we came up with was that 2909 really wasn't necessary because we had kind of covered what can be done in exempt settings in 2910. And that was really more of the focus, and the concern was what can people do, and not what are these exempt settings to begin with. So that was how we kind of came up with what we did.
Just a quick question. For line 20 on that page, psychologist licensed by the state instead of in? Because I think what we're trying to get to is that the primary supervisor, because I think that has a minute, but potentially licensed by whom, I think is my question, right? So licensed by the state versus licensed in the state, because theoretically one could claim to be a psychologist registered or licensed in another state, but who is just physically present in the state of California versus that is an overreach, I'm sure, but I'm just thinking through that preposition.
Well, and I don't think it doesn't help that state is lowercase, so it's not clear or overly clear that it's this state.
Right.
So.
Yeah, number 4, it says in the state, so primary supervisor licensed in the state.
So have as the primary supervisor a licensed psychologist by the state of California.
Or psychologist licensed by the state of California.
Yeah, yes.
Or by the state capital S, which would mean state of California.
Or
Yeah, capital.
a psychologist issues a
By the
license by
state.
the board,
By the board is fine.
Oh, okay,
that way?
okay.
Sorry.
No. I wouldn't have seen
We
that,
do
but
apologize, yeah.
What was the consensus?
licensed by the CAPB board? Or do we, it's all lowercase in statute, isn't it?
Yeah,
Licensed by the board.
I
by
get
the
so
board,
confused.
yeah.
Stephen.
Are we okay with that?
Yes, I think since we do have the benefit of CDCR here, I think at some point during public comment, I would love to hear their thoughts on this section, because this might apply to them.
Well, I was just about to
Oh,
see if there's public comment. I think what we're going to do is we'll go section by section, and if there's public comment, we'll take any public comment on any of the sections. So, in January 2000, well, sometime in 2015 and starting in 2016, we limited exempt setting, people working in an exempt setting to 5 years without being licensed. And so that's what this yellow part at the very bottom refers to, and that's why it says January 2016. If we change this now, because we've got all, do we change this last part?
So there wouldn't be any changes to 2910. It would just be deleting 2909.
Okay, okay. Except for the changes we just made?
Right.
Yeah, okay. All right, so is there any public comment about this?
Dr. Marilyn Umos from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. That seems reasonable to me. It's fairly redundant. If you look at the 2909 and 2910, I wouldn't see a problem with deleting the 2909. It's
Okay,
basically repetitious.
yeah. And confusing, actually, to people who read it, so,
This is much clearer, 2910.
okay, thanks. All right, so unless I see y'all just come up, we're just going to keep moving, okay? So we're at 2911.
Just to be really clear.
There is a comment, ask licensing committee if this was an intentional removal of this requirement. And I think what we removed there
So there-
was their postdoc folks are not called interns. So you could say postdoc trainee, that's fine. But postdoctoral folks are not called interns, that's pre-doctoral for psychology, so.
Sorry, Dr. Horn, which line were you looking at on?
It's line 39 on page 359 under 2911.
Got it.
Okay? Just to answer the question. If we just say psychology trainee, I think we're fine. But if you want to put postdoc trainee in there, that's also fine.
Just trying to read it with the interlineation. Psychology intern, psychology trainee.
Basically, we're saying we're not restricting the activities of
Right.
psychology graduate students or psychology trainees, you know.
It doesn't necessarily denominate the title that the institution's going to use
That's right.
for whatever the particular institution is. We're just describing
Right, a category.
general categories of, yeah.
So, but postdoctoral intern is not the correct title, is
Yeah,
all I'm saying.
yeah,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
You're usually a fellow,
Yeah, usually a fellow.
which sounds really fancy.
Ms. Winkleman.
I
Dr. Winkleman, sorry.
I was just wondering if, is there a difference between psychology intern or psychology trainee? And if there's not, would trainee cover both pre-doctoral and postdoctoral, in which case maybe we could just, maybe the word psychology intern could also be deleted, and the section could simply refer to psychology trainees.
Yeah, I agree. I think I thought that's what we had done. Like, we talked about graduate students and then just said trainees for folks who were getting supervised experience, but my memory might be wrong, so. But if we're going to keep postdoc in, we'll not call them an intern. Yes.
Mr. Poliati from CAPIC. My understanding was that the word intern was used to refer to someone at a formal placement, CAPIC APA or APIC internship, which oftentimes included both internship and postdoc placements. So is that how is this going to be impact if you remove the use of the word intern?
It shouldn't, if we leave psychology trainee in there,
Okay.
which we plan to do, it shouldn't have any impact whatsoever. We're just talking about how to identify these categories of folks.
I guess just as long as we do it universally, so that if we're not going to be using intern, then it's understood that we.
No, you can use whatever term you want. I mean, this is just, we're just trying to identify for these settings
Right.
that we're not going to, what we've just said in 2910 doesn't in any way restrict the activities of folks who are functioning in these capacities. That's all we're talking about,
Okay.
okay?
Again, well, even the title of it says students and interns. So
Right, we may even
we
change the
that.
title.
So
Yeah.
I just want to be sure that we're including both pre-doc and
Right,
doctoral and postdoctoral trainees.
correct.
That's all.
That's-
That was my concern.
Yeah.
We could,
Okay.
I mean, if we wanted to be more explicit, we could put pre-doctoral or postdoctoral psychology trainee.
We could. I mean, whatever, however we want to state it. I mean, this is really just,
Do we need to say psychology graduate student and psychology trainee?
well, technically, graduate students are trainees as well. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
right?
Maybe we should collapse this all down.
So we're not restricting services of graduate students, or we could say other psychology trainees. We could say that. Because graduate students, we're talking practicum experience, right? And
Right.
then after that, we're talking,
But I mean, you could say a psych assistant is a psychology trainee, right?
right?
So I wonder if psychology trainee is the right,
Okay, why don't we just say psychology graduate student, we could say psychology intern or postdoctoral
trainee.
trainee. Why don't we do that? Okay? That clarifies it. Graduate student, pre-doc, postdoc. Okay. All right? Okay. We got it?
Are you talking at the top or down at the, are you talking the intro or here or not?
Let's see. Psychology graduate student,
Then you want to psychology
comma,
intern.
down here. Psychology intern,
Okay. Okay, so.
Or-
I'm gonna strike this. Okay. This one, or
postdoctoral trainee.
trainee. Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Leading to degrees listed or accredited approved college. We want to take out approved college. We want to say regionally accredited. Right?
Could we do that? Or do we have to keep it until that goes away?
Yeah, because that's not changing just yet, I don't think.
But when will our pathways go into effect?
Oh, good point.
2020? Yeah. So isn't that when
It really is.
those programs are gone? I mean,
Or regionally accredited.
it's regionally accredited at that point, right? 2020? Approved schools go? When will this go into effect? We haven't decided yet, right?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, because that's when the requirement goes in, but that may still impact the people that did graduate from an approved course in the allotted time, and then they're in an internship program, or they're a psych assistant, or a trainee. So we still, at that time,
But they're
still
not in-
accepted their approved school, as long
They
as
could
they
still
were
be in the-
enrolled by 26, I think it was December 31st, 2016.
Right, but this is,
So,
this is currently,
But if you did a 5-year program, you'd be getting out in 2021 out of one of those programs, and then you could have a postdoc could be 1 or 2 year postdoc, so conceivably, we could still be seeing people that are coming through from approved
right.
schools.
but they won't be a,
You could,
So maybe we should just
you
leave
could
that
refer to a
alone.
degree that qualifies for licensure
Why
under
don't we say that?
2914B, and then you'd have to look at when they got their degree and whether or not.
So
It
take out
led to
reference to
licensure.
the accredited or approved college or university, and just put in the doctoral program leading to one of the degrees listed in section 2914B, period.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's not just one of the degrees, but it's a degree and the institution, so it's a degree that qualifies for licensure.
Yeah,
One of the degrees
Because
and
otherwise, it might
institution-
look like just the name of the degree.
So a degree that qualifies for licensure listed in section 2914B,
I think so.
and then pick back up at the or, and then the formal pre-doc internship part.
Why did he cross out S? Why did you cross out the S? Because it says one of the degree, to one of the degrees, isn't it?
listed in,
So then you can delete, add an accredited or approved college or university,
I think so.
and then pick back up at the word or. Yeah. Does that look right?
mm-hmm. Oh, I know why we took out postdoc. We might have also taken it out because we're just talking pre-doc here. Because there are pre-doctoral,
So APIC is postdoc,
no, it's
No, it's
pre and
pre-doc and
postdoc.
postdoc.
pre-doc and postdoc,
Yeah.
okay.
I always understood this was the carve-out for people that were going through training that was somehow affiliated with the institution that they were going to school at.
Or they're in a formal internship or postdoc.
Right.
So why are we even? Oh, yeah.
So 2910 deals with the exempt settings, so the government
Right.
and institutes and educational settings. So this, we're talking about mostly the internship programs.
Because they're still connected to, in accredited programs, that's also part of the degree requirement.
Right.
You know, the internship, so. So that's why we took out postdoc, and we should still take out postdoc.
But then the postdoc would have to fall into another category, right? So they would have to be a psychological assistant, they'd have to be in an exempt setting, right? Because it's the only one of those
So
hours.
we want to put them in, so then we want to add to the bottom here.
A formal
or in a formal
predoctoral-
pre-doctoral.
Or postdoc.
Or postdoctoral.
No, predoctoral internship or postdoctoral placement?
Yeah, or postdoctoral placement, yeah. That's good.
Because we don't want them to lose.
Right.
Because they're still in the, kind of in the carve-outs.
Right. I know. I can't read that far over there, though. I can't see that.
It's really hard to see this
Yeah.
angle when you're old.
No, I still can't, but that, my glasses aren't. I need to get them. It's time for a new prescription.
You go up to 359.
Okay, how does that look to y'all? Look okay? I think it looks good. Dr. Winkleman?
Hi, Elizabeth Winkleman, CPA.
Graduate student, if they're
I think it
postdoc.
looks good. I would just wonder whether the title now needs to be changed, because I wouldn't consider a postdoctoral placement to be a student or an intern necessarily.
We can always make suggestions to alleged counsel, but the titles of statutory sections is really a legislative counsel's function. So we can always
We don't
suggest
have it.
and
Statutes don't have titles generally.
Yeah, hopefully they wouldn't keep that title since it doesn't
They
quite
actually
fit
usually
it.
don't even have
Right,
state
but-
titles.
Yeah.
But my question is, as a, and I just don't know, as a.
Will you
post-
talk in the microphone?
Is a postdoctoral placement still for a graduate student? Are they still considered a student if they're postdoc?
No,
No.
it's still part of the,
Services as postgraduate
following the training
student.
path that's laid out
And then we
by
have the
graduate schools.
or, enrolled, or, okay, so it's or. Okay. Student, we're just gonna have to make sure that it's,
Is there any way you can just accept the changes right in this little part and we can read it, or no?
Can you show us without the markup?
Because it's not done in track changes, there's no button. We'd
Okay.
have to like take a break
Okay.
and I could paste it into a Word document and go through and,
student,
Okay.
and do it if you wanted.
Never mind. Yeah, never mind.
intern, trainee, enrollment program. Okay, so the only thing we have to make sure is that, you referred to the approval of the APA, APIC, KPIC, if that refers to both the pre-doc and post-doc.
We've
Pre-doc
said that,
internship.
or in a formal
Okay, so you
pre-doc.
just have to make sure that the punctuation is clear so that that refers to both pre-doc and post-doc is all. I'm trying to read it as if it were clean, and so you just have to make sure that and it's going to be hard to see without making it a clean
I think
copy.
it says that. Or in a formal pre-doctoral internship or postdoctoral placement approved by.
So I think what you would need is a comma after placement. So this way, it's more clear that the approved by APA, APIC, KPIC
Oh,
applies
it
to
applies
both.
to all of them, okay.
Applies to
Sure.
the students as well as the postdoc. Otherwise, it just looks
Yeah.
like it applies to
Okay, the post.
postdoc.
Okay,
Right.
great. Thank you. All right, we got it? All right, any other comment on this? So moving ahead.
I would,
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Pugliotti.
no, all good. I just recommend if we need to add a comment so that if we can't change the title ourselves, or you can't change the title yourselves, that something has to be included so that they know that there may be an issue with the title, that it needs to be possibly changed.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll actually recommend a title,
all
so, okay, thanks for that.
Statutes
Do
and
you,
titles. We give them the titles. Westlaw gives them the titles. West, then they're copyrighted. They don't tend to have titles.
I'm sorry? We got it? Okay,
Yep, we're good.
all right.
I just don't, I don't think statutes generally have titles. I think they're given by the publishers, so, and by
Okay.
the board,
All right, so.
so that they're not
do we-
violating
did-
copyright.
Is there anything you want to call it? Let's just put it there, and we'll make that suggestion or recommendation. Applicability of Chapter to students, comma, interns, comma,
And
and
postdoctoral
postdoctoral
trainees.
trainees. Moving on? Okay. Page 360, 2913. The yellow we take a look at, and there's a comment here as well. There's a comment to Ms. Marks, for Ms. Marks. So shall we start there?
I think the question was about the delegation, and I think that last sentence in sub C1, that primary supervisors may delegate supervision as prescribed by the regulations, I think that takes care of it.
Okay. Great. So let's take a look at sub C where, just to make sure that so here's where we basically say the supervisor, whatever the psych assistant does has to be commensurate with his or her training. I mean, essentially, they're going to be maybe learning new stuff, but the primary supervisor also has to have the ability to supervise in that area, right? And we've made the primary supervisor responsible for making sure that the psych assistant complies with all the stuff. So we're just going to keep going? Okay, unless I see anybody, we're just going to keep going, okay? Now we are page 361. This is where we changed we made it applied psychology, and we talked about the different areas of applied psychology.
Right.
So I'm just going to keep going, everybody. So now I'm at 2915 on page 363. All right, there are a couple of comments. Okay. Let's see. Board shall issue a license only to licensed psychologists. The board shall issue a renewal license only to, a licensed psychologist who's completed 36 hours of approved continuing professional development. Okay.
Yeah.
Licensed psychologist that renews or reinstates a licensed psychologist. So A isn't there. A is his or her. So we can say psychologists who renew or reinstate their license. That's fine. This is where I go nuts. Sorry, guys.
You wanted to say psychologist or licensed psychologists?
Well,
A licensed psychologist who renews or reinstates, is that what you said?
well, if it's singular, then it's his or her. If it's plural, if we say licensed psychologists who renew or reinstate their license, blah, blah, blah. But if we're saying a licensed psychologist, then it has to be his or her. So which do we want to do?
I think we almost always refer to it in the singular.
Okay, then it's his or her.
Okay, singular then. So just.
It's the great debate. I think we had this last time, didn't we?
Yeah, but Ms. Marks agreed with me, I think.
Always, Dr. Horn.
Hot topic at enforcement.
No, I think she agreed with me.
Always, Dr. Phillips.
Oh,
Always,
I
Mr.
see
Fu.
now.
You can just.
Okay,
Oh, that's right.
okay. Shall certify compliance with this section under penalty of perjury, blah, blah, blah.
What are they doing about binary gender in new statutes?
In statutes, I'm not entirely sure. I think we reached out to DMV to see what they were doing in regs, because DMV has dealt with it with respect to license changes, and I think they're referring to the plural, simply referring to plural, plural pronouns. But statutes, actually, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's.
I think there's a general statute.
Licensed
Using,
psychologists.
I think we have to start using plurals if, in talking about that.
I think there might be a general statute that says his refers to his or her, that there's, no specific reference to the gender, but I truly don't know what they're doing generally now.
On my copy, it says there for line 40. Or maybe I'm looking at the wrong.
Right,
No.
it does say there.
But it says a psychologist, so.
Oh, got it.
So that's where I went, but I'm wondering if we can say, if we can just use plural, and then that way it takes
Avoid
care
the-
of.
So the section 14 of the B&B code says tenses and genders. The present tense includes the past and future tenses, and the future, the present. Okay, I'm not sure what that means, but then it says each gender includes the other two genders. That's section 14.
There's more
So
than
if you say
future
one, you
tense.
mean them all. So if you have to say his or her, it means all.
All right, what do we want to do? Do we want to try getting a plural through? Licensees, licensed psychologists, and then use there? And then that takes care of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's not my preference grammatically, but it works.
So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go to plural?
Yep.
Okay. And,
Ms. Sork, are you grinding your teeth?
I'm sucking on a cough.
Oh, okay.
Drop, sorry.
I
are being
thought maybe you're
web-
having a hard time with it.
No, I actually reached out to the colleague of mine at DMV after we've been going through disciplinary guidelines, and I asked, because of the license issue, the application for gender status change, how they were using the language in their terminology in the regulations, and they said they're going towards there and plural, so.
Okay.
well, then that's,
Cool.
let's do that. Okay, great. So, we okay then? It's licensed psychologists?
Would the committee like to see a global change throughout the entire document?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
That's
maybe a
great. Yeah,
delegation to
thank
staff
you.
to complete that throughout the entire document?
Thank you so much.
Also grammatically, would it be licensed psychologists who renew?
yes.
Not that?
Correct. Who?
Renew or reinstate their license.
Yeah. Okay? All right. I don't know. All right, and then let's see, continuing professional development means certain learning activities. So this was my suggestion, take out continuing education learning activities, because it's not what it is. Okay? We all right with that? All right, I'm looking, I don't see anybody. Okay. We're continuing to move along.
I just had one question for Ms. Marks, and we had highlighted for her feedback on the reference to false statements submitted
Oh,
pursuant to
sorry
this
about
section.
that. Yeah.
Shall be a violation of section 2970, and just a question of what was the better reference for that citation.
I'm sorry, I did see the notes to me for the other, and I did not see the note to me for that, so let me take a look at that while you go on.
Okay, and we'll come back to page 363 for that. All right, moving along, we're now on page 364. And we've scratched out this one part.
Quick question, what was the policy reason behind that?
Because continuing professional development allows so many more options than just going to or attending a continuing education class, that we really didn't, you don't have to be there in person, there are all kinds of things like that, so we felt like they would licensees would have ample opportunity to participate in any of those. That's my recollection. Yeah, okay. Dr. Winkleman.
Hi, Elizabeth Winkleman, CPA. Are we talking about page 364, lines 37 and 38
Yes.
now?
Yes.
Yeah. I guess I would suggest that you consider leaving those in, because it's not a mandate. It's just giving you the flexibility if some extenuating circumstances come up. The CPD haven't been implemented yet, so it does give more flexibility for people, but I could still imagine there might be very unusual situations where a person would need an extension due to, I don't know, some terrible disaster, medical illness, fire, flood, something that was really unusual, and they had planned to complete their CPD in a certain period of time and weren't able to. So I ask that you consider retaining that, and it would still be up to the board whether or not there was a reasonable rationale to grant an extension.
Just to follow up on that, the part in the board's regulations for exemptions and extensions has been removed, and that was approved by the board. So whether or not you kept this in the statute, the draft regulations took out that mechanism to request for an exemption or extension of time.
Out of curiosity, how often do we get requests for extensions on continuing it? What has been called continuing education up until now?
I know that we have had a small number of people that were considered exempt because of the practice setting that they worked in, and that was kind of a historical exemption. There's also been extension requests for people that have sicknesses or illnesses. And I, just kind of going back to the board discussion on this, when the committee considered this item, I think the concern was, as a consumer protection, if you have an active license, that you should be able to comply with the 36-hour requirement. And unless people are all waiting until the end of their renewal period to accrue their 36.
Who would do that?
Well, hours that
Can't imagine.
may not be as big of an impediment or issue.
Yeah, that was our thinking. That it wouldn't be, so. Y'all okay?
Yeah,
Just
I
keeping
think we can
like
leave it out.
is? Okay, all right. Okay, moving along. We're on page 366, 2940. All right, so let's start with the yellow part, because I think that these other, I'm going to have to. So the yellow part is submit application in a manner prescribed by the board. That's it, basically. Okay, so these two comments here, incorporate application form in 1381. And then another comment, ask Tom if we can incorporate application and form in Breeze. Okay.
So that would just be staff effort, like if committee agrees with the language, then we'll just proceed with those
Okay.
2 items to follow up.
Okay. So we're okay with the language. Keep going. Now we're on page 367. Okay. We're granting a license to any person who passes our supplemental, has been licensed at least 2 years in another state or territory, or Canadian province, were substantially equivalent. Okay. So we changed it from 5 to 2 years
I don't recall why.
because why wouldn't we grant a license? Why does a person have to be licensed 5 years before we would grant a license? If they've met the requirement somewhere else, they've been licensed somewhere else for a couple of years, and they've met essentially our requirements, why would we say it has to be 5 years? I mean, that's restricting practice, really, folks coming in and becoming licensed, isn't it? I mean,
Well, restricts access to practice. Yeah, I can see that. It's just, 5 years seems like people would have gained more experience, they would have more time if they were going to get in disciplinary trouble for all that to have hatched out.
true, but folks tend not to get into disciplinary trouble till, I mean, not that they don't ever, but till they've been practicing 10 years or more, so, just to,
Fun fact.
that's what the statistics are about when people get in trouble, so.
No, related note of trouble. Do we need to put unencumbered license for the out-of-state portion, or is it just implicit in the assumption that they're licensed, it's a free and clear license?
I think part of the application review process is that we would consider enforcement or any disciplinary action from another state. We do an enforcement check for each application that comes in, whether they're in-state or out-of-state.
Thank you.
We okay? We all right? Okay. I want to go to 368 because page 368, even though it's not in yellow, where we talk about the board at its discretion may waive the examinations when in judgment of the board the applicant has already demonstrated competence in areas covered by the examinations. I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, it is within our, I don't think we have any way of assessing that, truly. And I think if people haven't taken the national licensing exam, and obviously haven't taken the,
So you're
well-
suggesting this first full paragraph on the page would be taken out?
yeah. Well, I think the board could waive the examination, but it's not, we would never not waive the CPLEE, and I don't think.
We're not going to waive the EPPP,
And we're not going to waive the EPPP.
Or
so,
EPPP, but
yeah, so people who are ABAP have taken the national licensing exam, but just in case, I mean, I don't think we ought to say that we're waiving any exam.
If I may ask a question, I don't know, but does the requirements for ABAP require the completion of the EPPP?
Yeah, essentially.
Okay, because my understanding of this requirement is so that they don't have to take the test twice.
Well, they won't have to take it twice. We're not making anybody take it twice because we already have a score from folks. And we've said if they're licensed somewhere else, you know, if they haven't taken the exam, obviously they'd have to take it. But as far as I know, there's only one jurisdiction that doesn't require the EPPP, and that's Puerto Rico. And that's the only jurisdiction I'm aware of that doesn't require that in the United States and Canada. So, and we would never waive that anyway, right? Because we have no way of knowing that they've demonstrated competence or anything like that. So that's my suggestion, to take that paragraph out. Anybody? Okay. All right.
I would concur with the suggestion.
I mean, from my perspective, it's always, if it's
Take out.
enumerated there, we don't have to exercise that ability. And I think in the last situation, the board already had taken away that discretion. Not on this point, but on the previous page on 366 or hold on. Ms. Stork, you had mentioned that the board had previously taken that out, or in the other section, correct?
Right, we have talked about it. I think we just need to make all our sections consistent.
But in this particular one, the board has not.
Right, so we should take it out. We're not gonna do this.
I don't think the board should have the discretion to do this, actually.
Yeah,
And that's a bedrock requirement for licensure.
it
It'd be like saying-
absolutely is.
It's like saying you can get a driver's license without passing the driving test.
Right, yeah, without taking it even.
I'm just thinking through in conversations right now that the task force is having about the two-part exam, and that's an ongoing conversation. And so, and there's a lot of discussion still left about that portion. So I think, I'm just trying to think through if this is how urgent this issue is, in the context of everything else of the
That's
of what we're
going
having.
on.
Yep. And I totally agree with both of you that I could never see us waiving examination right now, but we also don't know what the future holds, and
Well, we never, I mean, in
yes.
a way, we never know what the future holds.
Right.
I hear what you're saying, that we're still looking, and there are changes coming down the pike, and we're still looking at those, but I guess I'd rather take it out of here, and then if things change, because this is our pathways to licensure, and currently, this is the way things are.
Mhm.
And things won't be changed till 2020. So I would definitely want to I don't want us to waive or even have the option of waiving the national licensing exam.
Section.
If we do something different, then
Section on
we
waiver.
come back and take a look at this. That's my thought. But if we don't, then I think it's really a mistake to do that.
I think given that we wouldn't be acting on it, then leaving it in there wouldn't be a problem, so the reverse
I mean,
logic.
I'm hearing what you're saying, but I don't want to,
Yeah.
I guess my own sense is I don't want to give a message to anyone that they can come in this state and not have to meet requirement,
Real quick, just a background on this section, and how we got to this point from the staff highlighted recommendations. We had an applicant from Puerto Rico that applied to the board, and it was our understanding that the EPPP was required, and it was, and then it changed. And it was just a fairly recent change, I want to say a year ago.
No, it was only a requirement for a very brief period of
Okay.
time. So it hadn't been required some years ago, and then it was required for about 2 years,
Okay.
and then it wasn't required anymore.
And then it was optional.
Then it's always been optional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Except for that brief
that's how
time.
the staff recommendation kind of came to be in that part.
I'm not sure we have the right folks in the room, but quick question, do we get a lot of requests for waivers of examination currently?
No, we don't, but I think it just, like Ms. Rorick said, like in cases like this, it's important to have the clarity for the board to really enact our requirements regarding licensure. But we don't get a lot of these requests.
So even though it's in there currently, it seems like most applicants understand that they should be taking the exam and as a part of their application, and that's a pretty clear message from the board that that's the process you should be going through.
Right.
I'm going to suggest that possibly you want to look at this side by side with section 1388.6 of your regs, which is a whole section on the waiver of the exam, and potentially consider that while we understand that every state and Canadian province requires EPPP.
Yeah.
You don't know what they're going to require, and you don't know what they allow with respect to foreign trained psychologists either. So I think we've seen that issue with people who are licensed and have been licensed in other countries as psychologists. So you might want to look at those side by side and make sure that what you change or consider changing in the statute is then consistent with that reg that you have,
1388.
1388.6.
Yeah, I think, haven't we talked about this? Because we don't want to, I mean, this has been certainly my thing. We do not waiver examinations for people who have been licensed in another U.S. or Canadian jurisdiction, right? I mean, don't we look at foreign trained, I mean, other than Canadian and U.S., don't we look at them differently?
I'm going to throw something, kind of a curveball into the mix, and I apologize for throwing a curveball here, but given the timeline for the coming of the EPPP2 and our task force for the EPPP2 task force is taking a look, will be in June taking a look at the examination statutes and regulations. If the committee comes to an agreement on a general direction on waiving or not waiving, since Mr. Fu also sits on the task force, when we discuss that statute and that regulation, because those sections will be pulled out of pathways and will be treated separate and above as priority, given the quick timeline, and I'm not sure when pathways is going to be completed and through the process, so we're pulling out the provisions of the statute and the regulations dealing with exams. So does that make sense? So if you guys came to kind of a general agreement about waivers, yes or no, for out-of-state or foreign applicants, Mr. Fu could bring that intent to the task force and provide that as input into the process, and then obviously it'll come before the board for another opportunity for public input and feedback. So I just thought I'd throw that curveball in there.
It's not a curveball, I mean, it's helpful. I don't think it's a curveball anyway. I mean, I think it's helpful to think about it, because y'all are going to be looking at that. So I'm going to state my thought again. We should not be waiving national exams.
Interestingly, if you do look at 1388.6, there's several categories where we say they don't have to take the EPPP.
I know, and we shouldn't be doing that.
I would agree.
Absolutely.
I would agree.
Again, I think going through, just hearing the discussions going on at the task force and some, understanding that in other states, there are provisions there that may or may not include both parts of that exam. I think that leaves a lot of unresolved questions that I'm just not comfortable saying that we should take it out at this moment in time, given those ongoing. And I wouldn't be even comfortable saying that is a consensus view from this committee to that task force either, from where I sit, just because those that long day conversation, seems like there's a lot of different approaches, not only that are occurring elsewhere as well. And so I would like us to since it's not a pathways to licensure issue at this time in the highlighted issues, I think we just leave it alone and not make that recommendation, from my perspective. But is that what you were going for, Ms. Sorg?
An additional option, not so much as a consensus of the committee, if not all of the committee members agree, but just for purposes of bringing up the question or the issue of waiver of examination to the task force, it may be helpful to inform the discussion and get the feedback from the stakeholders about that issue, because the stakeholders may have also concerns about certain groups or entities being exempt from taking the national exam. So it may not be per se, if the committee today doesn't want to say we're recommending getting rid of the waiver, but if you wanted to pose it as a question to the task force about considering whether or not to think about taking out or not, is another way to put it.
I think Dr. Horn and I are in accord that the licensing exam that requirement needs to be satisfied by all licensing categories. So if you want to take an opinion back, I know it'll be a 2-to-1, it sounds like. If you want to take an opinion back to the task force, the opinion of the licensing committee majority is that there should never be an exemption from the national licensing exam or the CAPLE. Now, that's not necessarily the board's position, but that's our position.
And I'm going to look to Ms. Marks if this is a possibility, but if Mr. Fu could say that there was a discussion and a majority agreement that there was concerns about exemptions to the national licensing exam, and we'd like to get some input and feedback from the group to better inform the discussion. If that is something, I don't know if you need a motion on that, or if, how that would look.
I think I don't see the necessity for a motion unless the committee wants to direct Mr. Fu to do that, as opposed to, I think it was his idea that he wanted to bring that back. So I don't see the necessity for a motion, because I think you wanted to express that to the task force, right?
I don't have, and you don't have, right? So, I mean, that's what you're thinking about, so I think that, that sounds good, that just bring it back. This is, the majority of the committee does think this way, and that's, but we would like input. That sounds good to me.
So maybe we could leave this in for the moment and annotate it?
Annotate it, put a little comment there, because we're going to, we'll take, yes.
Yeah.
And obviously, we're still working on pathways.
We're lost somewhere on the pathway.
This is
Note there
a
are
long and
multiple
winding
pathways,
road
it's
here.
plural, so we've just taken the longer path.
It's a multidimensional space.
Okay, y'all, it is, I think we're through with this section right now, so, and it's a little after 12, so let's say we take a hour for lunch. How long do we want to take?
An hour.
Hour? Okay. Everybody, we're taking an hour for lunch. We will come back at 1:10. Later than we originally said, but welcome back, public. So for those on the website who are just looking at us, we've gotten a lot smaller here. All righty. So where are we? We are now
370, page 370?
page 370. Oh, yeah, okay. $370. All right, here we are. Line 18. So this is basically saying that only psychologists can be primary supervisors. Psychology associate is not a term we're going to use now, right? So it'll be psychological associate? Is that right?
We
So,
take that section out, don't we?
right, because this deals with the prior registered
Oh, right,
psychologist category.
Okay. Yeah, we take that whole H out, section H out. And what about I? Oh, an intern, yeah, that's fine. Okay, so that's all right. We're just basically saying who primary supervisor is. Okay. And now we move to rolling this up. Is that it? I think so. All right.
Now on to regs.
And regs start on page
418, 419?
statutes, regulations, 418, yeah. Well, that's the memo, so,
And really quick before we get to that, one of the attachments was the background research on the one-time pre-licensure coursework requirement. And I just want to give a shout out to Mr. Leitzel, who is no longer with the board. He is going to be focusing on his schoolwork at Sac State. But him, along with Ms. Lim, went to state archives and pulled all these records and spent many hours doing some legislative history research work. So I just want to give a shout out to the staff for pulling that information together.
that's hard on your eyes, isn't it?
Because it's inverted, right?
Yeah. And it's blurry looking.
She's young.
Oh, well, that's true. Are you a millennial? Sure. Okay, then you're young.
Do you embrace that with more warmth?
I'm not going to say anything negative, about it. Okay. Looks to me like we're on page 420, 380.3 definitions. Okay, so first of all, we just define who a psychology trainee is working under one of these categories. Everybody okay with that? All righty. Then 1381.2, looks like we took it out because it is already in 2914.
Sorry, I just want to clarify on the attachment. So the one that the one that committee should be looking at is actually on page 473.
Oh,
Because that
wow.
would be the one that is not everybody's psych assistant.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you.
473?
473.
Yeah.
We like how we're jumping up in those numbers.
We're almost done.
Famous last.
Okay, thank you so much. So, all right, well, we still are, so far it's the same. Okay, then next page, 474, 1381.5, we, applicant fails to pay the initial license fee within 3 years after notification. We're going to determine that that license application is abandoned.
Right.
All right. So we're taking out all this about processing times. Okay. Keep going.
481.
Okay, page 481. Revised criteria for evaluation of education. Okay, so that's where we talk about the fields of applied psychology that we do. And compliance with section 2914 of the code. Okay, so what we're saying is if it's not obvious from the transcript that it's in one of these areas, we
Right.
may require a letter. So we're all okay with that. Okay, now we're on the next page, 482. There's a comment. Does a committee want trainees in areas of general applied psychology to meet all the same requirements as other trainees? And the answer is yes.
Did somebody have something in particular in mind?
I'm not sure who commented on this. LN2?
I was told it's just a clarifying comment for staff. For staff.
Okay.
So if that's the direction, then we'll just make the correct reference. So we just want to make sure so that we know what direction that we're heading to.
Yeah. It's the same requirements regardless of area of psychology. Okay. There may be different ways to get those requirements met depending on the area, but yeah, no difference in requirements. Okay. Page 483. Oh, this is, again, registered psychologist. Sorry, and that's all going to be changed. So let's go to 484, top of the page. Primary supervisor may delegate supervision to other licensed mental health professionals who meet the requirements of Section 1387. And we're just saying that's true across the board again.
Right.
Okay. And let me just say, this, again, I want to say, remember how much trouble we had coming up with this hours of supervision? I mean, so this is so good. So,
Mr. Glass-Steagall would really like you to revisit that today.
so we've already been through this, but I just want to make sure that the public sees this and okay with it. We've clarified what this is. All right. Page 485. Okay, so if it's an orange thing, it's y'all, it's just to you. And if it's a different color, it's something we should pay attention to.
And this is something that came up recently at a licensing unit staff meeting, and it's not highlighted, but it is in this section. So on page 485, section 6, or the new section 6, where it talks about prior to the start of the experience, there was some discussion about the part that we added a few years back, and that was about the original agreement accompanying the application for licensure, and just trying to understand the intent of the board at that time, to see if you wanted the actual original document or agreement, or if it was just you wanted the agreement to accompany the application and have the signing and dating and everything happen prior to the experience. So I didn't know if the committee wanted to discuss the flexibility of the word original in that section or not, but I just thought I would throw that out there since you're looking at that language.
Yeah, that's
There's
good.
a
That's
lot
helpful.
there's a lot of confusion about that with psychological assistants.
Yeah.
And sometimes they have, because they're not perhaps as anal as some other people are, they don't necessarily, aren't able to access the original agreement, in which case they come to me and I give them a copy of their agreement. So I think a copy should be
Oh,
sufficient
absolutely,
for our
absolutely.
purposes.
I don't think original
Is necessary,
is
is it?
necessary.
Assigned original?
So if that's the will of the committee, if we just remove the word original and just said the agreement shall accompany the application, and then we talk about what the agreement should entail, is the committee okay with that?
We might want to say a copy of the agreement
Yeah.
shall accompany.
Just a thought that, from a staff perspective, I don't think it matters if it's the original or a copy, as long as it's the agreement.
Right.
Then that way, it gives us more flexibility. And then, I mean, if you say it's the copy, then does it have to be the copy because you've specified copy? So I would just argue if you just
Say the
put
agreement?
the agreement, then we could accept it either way.
Yeah, I mean, that was my thinking. It should be able to be accepted anyway. I think my guess is for trainees, you're going to get more calls. Does it have to be the original or can it be a copy? That's where I was going with that. So
Well, maybe we could just say the original or a copy of the agreement. Then it's pretty clear. They don't have to call to see, I don't have the original, am I not going to be able to send
that's
it
just
to you?"
my thought, because
I think you're right.
you know how folks
Yeah, I think you're
get
right.
anxious about, wanting to do exactly the right thing. So that was my thought. If we just say it can be a copy, then
Ms. Marks?
I'm just trying to remember what the issues were. I think part of the problem was that the original had been required, but because it wasn't required until the end of the experience, that then people had a hard time getting their hands on it. And if the issue is that you do want the original, you do want to see that it's contemporaneous with the start of the experience, then you can require the original. It's just, I think you just need to figure out what you want to be able to establish that they've met the requirements. And if you don't care, because you're getting it prior to the start, hopefully, of the experience, then you can just say the agreement, and in the instructions, you could specify one way or the other. But, I think that was the issue, was because they were not getting, the agreements were not being sent in until after the experience was completed, that there seemed to be a real problem. I'm trying to think if
there
there's
was
a
some
reason.
indication that they actually weren't in place before the experience started.
Correct.
So one thing the staff could do is, because we're going towards using our forms and applications in the regulations, so we don't have this clarity issue, we could, in the instructions of the agreement form, put a copy or an original agreement
Oh,
will
that's a
be
good idea.
accepted along with the application to the
That's a good
board.
idea.
That sounds good.
Okay.
So now we're just going to say the agreement.
Right.
Okay,
Okay.
all right? Okay.
So right now, we have struck the language here on line 17. So this is we're only requiring the original agreement to accompany the application for licensure.
Right.
So it's not necessarily the registration. So are we saying that we are allowing a copy to be submitted for the licensure application as well? So that would be like a departure from existing practice.
Correct,
Okay.
right? I mean, people don't, honestly, they do not keep those original documents, Maybe supervisors do. but,
I do.
Yeah. I mean, supervisors should, but,
Yeah.
so. I mean, if we want to have some way to ensure that this is really, is really genuine and isn't made up, I don't know how to do
We
that
don't really-
other than order the, request the original, but I think that's just so hard to do. By the time someone's had their experience and is submitting stuff for licensure.
I know where the problems come up before, where people have used a form that didn't exist until after the date of the agreement was purportedly signed.
Right,
So that's where I think the big,
that's right,
that kind of gives itself away.
yeah,
Sometimes in their narratives, they give themselves away.
right,
Right. But otherwise, there's no way, we're not going to do ink testing or something.
right. So we're fine. Okay.
Dr. Horn, we spoke at the beginning, before the meeting started, about the 6-hour supervision course.
Oh,
Did you
yeah.
want to talk about that? And that's.
Thank you. Where is that?
Remind me again. That's in here, in this section?
You can talk about that as, it depends on where the committee would like to go, because it could be part of the renewal requirement for supervisor, or it could be,
But what section of the reg?
Where is it in the regs? But that's about supervisors. Is it about
Yes.
the requirements to be a supervisor?
so
Okay.
you can, I think it's in this section where it talks about supervision requirement. I can find that specific.
Okay. So, yeah, thanks. And I'll tell y'all what this is. We have a requirement that people who are serving as supervisors are required to take, I guess, every licensure renewal as long as they're supervisors, this course in supervision, like they were talking about, that they require their supervisors to take. I'm sorry,
Oh, it's
Stephanie.
page 487 at the top.
Right.
Okay.
Under
Line
number
5.
1.
Okay, prior to functioning. So shall we just wait till we get to 487 and then we'll take a look at this? So let's go back to 485 and we'll come back. Thanks, Ms. Chung, for finding it and thanks for mentioning it. Okay, so we're back on 485. And we're going to incorporate the VOE form by reference into this. We've decided to do that, and so that means that everybody uses the same form. Is that correct? Okay. And then the next comment should be submitted at time. The supervisor agreement should be submitted at the time of licensure, but not in an application for registration. And staff is recommending that. That's fine. We really want to know after the fact, right, that the person has had the experience.
We used to put staff through the process of looking at the
Right.
plan for supervision, which, for all their strengths, they're not necessarily prepared academically to
Right.
do, so it's just another piece of paper that's going to float around. Better
Right.
to have it come in with a license, right?
Right,
License application.
so that's fine. So we're okay with that. All right, now we're on page 487 and number 1. So prior to functioning as a supervisor, every 2 years after that, 6 hours approved continuing education. Could it be now we can make it continuing professional development in supervision that meets the requirements? So,
Or do we want them to take a continuing education class?
no,
Or do we want them to, like, for instance, maybe be in a peer supervisor group?
exactly.
Or some kind of collaborative team where they talk about supervising? a
Well,
particular
that's what
person?
I'm saying, it should be CPD.
Yeah, I'm just posing the
think
question
there-
out loud.
Yeah, because one of the things I've heard from folks is that the course doesn't change. It's the same all the time. So I think that, it's a lot of times like how when we had to take the ethics course and this didn't change, code of ethics doesn't change very much from time to time, year to year. So I think we want to say continuing professional development. I think we should say 6 hours. That's good. It's consistent with all of our other stuff. But then we want to have some way of tracking this because right now we don't have a way of tracking this. So I don't know that it needs to be written here, but we might say as part of what would count toward continuing professional development in a 2-year period, right? And then that could be monitored for folks who are being supervisors. We could ensure that their continuing professional development includes this course in supervision.
In other words, it should be documented in some way that
Yeah.
they've done this,
Yeah,
so that if,
and that we can see it, yeah,
but we will only see it if we audit them,
right,
correct?
right. Unless we want to say that supervisors, we just want to make sure you're taking it, because,
It is one of the anomalies of being a primary supervisor, that you do, I always make sure that I have done this every couple of years, but nobody really knows whether you've done it or not.
right, exactly.
Yeah,
And
and even this way,
so why bother requiring it if we don't take a look? Now, so maybe the person has to just say on their renewal, I have taken, if a primary supervisor, I certify that I've taken
6 hours.
6 hours of
Within the
continuing
last-
professional development, within the last 2 years. And then that way, if that person is pulled and they've checked that, then we can look. So it's still a random audit, but
Another reason to require it, even if it's not demonstrated as a matter of course, is that if the board got a complaint about a supervisor, one of the pieces of information they might gather is whether or not the supervisor had indeed
Right.
taken the test.
Right,
or the-
exactly.
I'm sorry, the
Exactly.
course.
So maybe we could do it that way. We could suggest that on your renewal for licensure, something like how we have to check. I've had all the continuing education. I've had law and ethics. I've had or social justice or.
It'd have to be broken out in some way that on the renewal application, it said for primary supervisors
Yeah.
or psychology trainees.
Yeah.
As opposed to, not everybody's going to have to check that box because a lot of people don't do
That's right.
supervision.
So it would start like that, if a supervisor, a primary supervisor, huh? They should if they're,
Some of them are people.
yeah. So we could put that on the renewal form, and then if they're audited, we've got that check. Or if there's a complaint against somebody, that's one of the things we can look at too.
It would also be, I think, a great reminder for people. It's not like you necessarily put the date that you last took the supervision class on your calendar and then put a reminder for 2 years out. Maybe somebody does, I don't, I'm not that efficient.
But it says every renewal cycle after that. After you first take it, then it's it says
I just
every
take it
2
every
years
license.
thereafter.
Yeah, I take it every licensing
Yeah,
cycle.
every licensing cycle would be good.
I'm wondering if it would make sense after it says in every 2 years thereafter, if we just put prior to function as a primary supervisor and as a condition of license renewal,
Yeah,
the supervisor shall complete 6 hours of approved continuing professional development and supervision that meets the requirements, blah, blah, blah.
that sounds good. Sound good?
Mhm.
And then we would,
Do we need to put the certification language in the statute?
we don't have it in, I don't think we have it for the other things that we certify too.
So it'd be
We
in
can
regs?
just put it in there, huh?
It'd be in regs?
I don't even know if it's in regs. It's just on our licensure renewal form,
Right.
yeah.
What do you think? And the way I'm thinking of it is, right now we ask if you're compliant with law and ethics as a condition of renewal, and I'm seeing it as another box
Yeah,
in on the online renewal. I'm sure we could add it to the renewal form as well, but to say, are you a primary supervisor of a trainee? Yes, no. If yes, then are you in compliance with the 6-hour continued professional development requirement? Yes, no. If yes, please keep documentation in case of an audit or something to that effect. I'm just
Are you talking about on the renewal form?
on the renewal form.
Well, then everybody has to keep documentation anyway, so.
Right.
Of their continuing professional development or CE, so,
Right.
yeah.
But in particular about the course on supervision would be the question. But I'll defer to Ms. Marks on how that would
I
look.
think, I'm trying to think this through, but it seems to me that the time periods for supervision don't necessarily track renewal periods the way CE does, and it may not be, you may not do it on a 2-year schedule because you're not supervising anybody for that period of time, and then you start supervising somebody again.
Then you have to
Then you may have to
Take it
redo it, but
prior
you
to-
may not, it may not, you may not have certified on that, on your last renewal because you weren't supervising at the time. It doesn't seem to track with renewal the way other CE does, which is actually a function of renewal. So I'm just not
The other
clear.
option is the annual report, if we could somehow incorporate it into the
Mhm.
annual report.
What annual report?
Question to that is, annual report only applies to psych assistant.
Right.
So any other trainee, like, we don't have that report.
Right.
Right.
That's
So
true.
there's no way to track them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so for those group of trainees, their supervisor, the easiest way I could think of is their license renewal for now. But again, like, I agree with the concern that Ms. Marks points out, because the supervision period doesn't necessarily overlap with the recycle period too. I mean, like the renewal period. Yeah, so.
So supervisors in exempt settings are going to not have to do this, right? Who will this apply to?
Everybody, yeah, everybody.
Does it currently apply to everybody? So regardless of where you're supervising, in a formal internship or postdoc or exempt setting, part of your requirement is to. So really, the only place I think it would make a difference, because once you're a supervisor at a formal placement, you're a supervisor. So every 2 years is fine, or every license renewal. So I think the place it will make a difference will be in private practice, those kind of settings, and otherwise, that's one of their functions, you know.
For the question related to just the timing of the renewals with the timing of the supervisor, experience is not the right word, but period, would it, if we altered the question to say, in the last 12 months, or in this past cycle, have you served as a supervisor? Yes. If you've served as a supervisor during this period, primary supervisor in this period, did you complete the 6 hours of continuing professional development?
Good.
Yes. So would that address the issue if we put in this past period, have you served as a primary supervisor, to address that concern by Ms. Marks?
Because then we would expect to see a course.
So yeah, we're looking
Or something.
backwards, not
Yeah,
forward.
Yeah.
No, I'm not sure because, again, of the overlap, because let's say at the very beginning of that renewal period, you were a supervisor, but you didn't do the course because you'd done it prior to the start of that supervision. It doesn't quite track. I think there's got to be some other way of ascertaining whether or not they've met the requirements.
Well, don't people have to keep their, we have to keep our licensure renewal stuff for 2 cycles, right? 4 years. So maybe that's a way, if there's a question about it, maybe that's a way of answering.
I'm wondering if we don't tie the renewal to the continued professional development for the supervision course, but if we just in the renewal process ask if you are a primary supervisor, and then we could, as part of our audit, randomly pull a report of people that are self-identified as primary supervisors to then audit them for the 6-hour course requirement. So not tying it to the renewal, but having them self-identify in the renewal
Yeah.
if they provide primary supervision. And then we can, staff, run a report on who has self-identified as that, and then incorporate some of those folks into our audit process.
That sounds good.
Just to,
And then if
Yeah.
we have to go back further because of that switch or something like that, we can do that. Yeah, I think that's, Ms. Marks? Does that sound all right?
Yeah, I think that would work. I just would be a little bit leery of tying it to renewal and have it be a function of eligibility for renewal.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Question over
do you
on
want
this
to,
side.
let's see,
Dr. Horn?
yeah.
Just a quick question.
Uh-huh.
So when we ask the licensee to self-identify, would we make that a requirement if they are primary supervisor, they have to identify? Because again, it's like a self-report question.
Mhm.
If they maybe omit to
Yeah,
self-identify, I think we would want to have some kind of ability to, oh, hey, you're a supervisor, and to seek just a reason why you didn't identify that, if you know what I'm saying.
yeah. So it would be similar to when we say to people, you know, if you check this, you're certifying essentially under penalty of perjury that you've done what you've said you've done. Yeah. And then when we check, we'll see it. So it should be one of those questions, right?
You could have, well, it comes in on the questionnaire for, with the registration, right?
so
One of the
that's
questions
just
on
for a psych assistant, though.
Right.
So what we're trying to capture is the people that are providing primary supervision to all psychological trainees. And the only mechanism I'm seeing is the renewal process for that. And if there is do you provide primary supervision to a psychological trainee, yes or no, then we just, the requirement's already there that they, as part of their CE requirements, get the 6-hour supervision course, but I'm seeing that as the trigger to pull a report of those people that are primary supervisors, and we know that because they've checked that box in the renewal, and then we know a certain percentage of those folks we would have to audit to make sure that they complete the course, because otherwise, I'm just not sure how else we would know.
Well, it comes in with the agreement for psych assistants, and then it would come in for everybody else at the time of application for licensure, right?
Right. So that would be after the supervision takes place.
So, I think we want to change this. First of all, it's not every 2 years thereafter. It's, or as a condition of renewal, right? Wait, hold on. We want to say prior to functioning as a primary supervisor, and I guess we could still say every 2 years thereafter. That would be fine, but take out as a condition of renewal. Supervisor shall complete 6 hours of approved continuing professional development requirements, blah, blah, blah. I would say this 6 hours can be counted as part of the continuing professional development requirement, right?
That's in there.
Where?
Because it says shall complete those, the continuing professional development, that meets
Yeah.
the requirements. So that's already kind of
Oh,
implicit.
that meets the
in that
requirements.
section.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so it's clear that people can use that 6 hours as part of their,
Quick question, for the every 2 years thereafter, it suggests that they remain a primary supervisor.
as long as they're a primary supervisor.
Because
Yeah.
I think reading currently, should we clarify that if they remain, every 2 years thereafter, if they remain a supervisor? Yeah, there we,
Yeah, that's good.
It seems to me they're already certifying under penalty of perjury when they sign the verification of experience form that they've met the 2-hour requirement. So why are we having them do it on the licensing application too? The licensing renewal application?
Because we're going to take a look at it. We don't have any way of tracking on the licensing renewal application that who is supervising. So we have still no way of,
And we wouldn't get the verification of experience forms till they put in the licensure application, correct?
well,
that makes-
no. It doesn't come from the supervisor.
Well, they sign the verification of experience form.
I know, but
They give it to the supervisee. The supervisee will send that in with their licensing
when
application.
they get licensed.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
Okay.
Okay, we're all right?
Yeah, we're
Okay.
good. We're good.
Are we all right here? Sorry. All right. Certify under penalty of perjury to completion of the 6-hour course, yeah, so, but that's a different process and goes somewhere else. 6 years from the date of completion. And we require them to keep it for 6 years, why? When everything else is 4 years?
I don't know. Probably because of the length of time.
For a registration.
Somebody might be in,
Right.
yeah, okay.
That makes
But
sense.
now that's 5 years, right? Registration?
Well, it's 6 years right now. We want to change it to.
But in pathways, it's 5.
It's 5.
It'll be 5.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can say 6, it's a round number, but it's an extra
I bet we're going to get a lot of feedback on the move from
5
6
is
years to
around
5.
number,
5. 5 is
It's also a round
an
number.
odd number.
But it's a round number.
Yeah, but 6 is rounder.
It's a prime number.
If I may ask a question to the committee, am I correct that the CE documentation must be maintained for 4 years,
That's the coolest.
You are correct.
and this is maintained for 6 years?
That's just what we were talking about.
Okay.
So, but what we said was that
You gave
5,
basics.
because that's how long that's what we're discussing, whether it should
I'll
be
send you
5,
the
because that's how
title
long we
of the
give
series.
for
Would be a psych assistant?
psych assistants,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Gotcha.
So 5, okay?
That's the length of time within which they've got to accrue their experience,
Right.
right? But they may not be applying right away, so I think maybe the 6th is that cushion
Yeah. Okay,
for,
so we'll leave it 6.
6.
All right. All right.
Elizabeth have comments.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I know. I've been seeing you up there and now just, Dr. Winkleman.
I just had a quick suggestion. Is on the,
No.
okay. Oh, yeah.
There you
Oh, there we go.
I just had a quick suggestion, which is that I think that most psychologists, when they're renewing or when they're doing the continuing education, they're looking at it when they are renewing their licensure. And I'm wondering if it might be possible to just say, have them certify to completing if they are, check off if they are a primary supervisor, and then if they've completed any required CE relating to supervision, and then you can link to the actual regulation so people can look at what's required. So they wouldn't necessarily have during that 2-year period, but they might have had to do it during that 2-year period, and that would make it easier to audit them, because it would go with the regular audits. And the other thing is, I think that if it's going to need to be maintained for longer than 6 years, that it really needs to be highlighted to people. I mean, longer than 4 years, it should be highlighted to people that they need to maintain that longer, because if they've been trained for, 20 years, you maintain your CE documentation for at least 4 years, that should be highlighted, or perhaps just keep it 4 years, because this part is not about the supervision itself.
Right.
It's about, did the person take the appropriate CE during that period? So I don't know that it's necessary to keep it longer. And if we're talking about streamlining the pathways and so forth, I think it might you may be able to accomplish this in a more simple way by just saying, if you have any required supervision, CE, CPD, do it now, and we may audit you.
I think both those suggestions are really good. Y'all agree?
Again, I just caution against mixing apples and oranges, that the supervision course is not a function of licensure, it's not a function of renewal, and I think it's confusing what is actually required to keep your license
With
active.
what's required to be a supervisor.
Correct. And I would suggest you not mix the two.
Okay, so the way we had originally said you think would be clearer?
I think so. Well, trying to remember exactly where we were before this began.
Ms. Marks, just going back to my original thought, which was having an identifier on the renewal process so that we knew who were primary supervisors of our licensees, so therefore it wouldn't be a condition of renewal, but it would help us identify who is a primary supervisor, and then as part of our audit process, because they are required to meet the requirements of the CE requirements, as part of being a primary supervisor, that we would know who to audit. I think that's the challenge we have, is who do we audit? Because we don't know until their trainee is licensed or submitting an application for licensure. And then by that time, that 6-hour course may be
Well, you know for the
irrelevant.
psych assistants, because you'd know in advance for the psych assistants, right?
But I would say more of our applicants are not psych assistants.
They're going
and
through.
They're going through other pathways.
If the same, and I think I heard Dr. Horn saying that if, once you've become a supervisor at a particular setting, you're kind of set as a supervisor. I mean, I think it's, at some point you'd have that list. You could do it. I just would not want to see that if for some reason somebody did not check that box, that somehow they haven't committed any misconduct by failing to check the box that they were a supervisor during that renewal period.
Why don't we
'Cause it's just
say,
not-
rather than were you yes, no, why don't we say if you were a primary supervisor during, if you were a primary supervisor during this period of time, did you meet all the,
Do APIC and KPIC know who their supervisors are? Could you get a list from APIC and KPIC?
not necessarily.
I don't think we have the authority to ask them, because what if they don't provide it?
No, yeah, it doesn't.
Well, they don't keep
have
it
the
either.
resources to
They
track
don't-
at
they
that
don't.
level of detail.
Yeah.
I do see what you're saying, though, Ms. Marks, and that is that putting it on the licensing application somehow mixes it into the renewal process, the licensing renewal application.
Right, because you sign the renewal under penalty of perjury. Let's say you forgot to check the box, or you think, well, I just ended a supervision, I'm not sure I'm going to supervise again, and you don't check it. It's not a condition of renewal, it's not a
And just
eligibility
from a
for.
staff perspective, I think anytime we get a deficiency in a renewal, it would just be a follow-up, that we would follow up with that person, and we wouldn't put a hold on the renewal. We would just follow up with that individual and say, you didn't mark yes or no that you were a primary
But
supervisor.
let's look at it a different way. I get the application for renewal, I'm not a primary supervisor.
Right.
I'm not great at filling out forms, they confuse me. And I get to this thing about primary supervisor, and I don't know why I'm filling, why, am I supposed to be a primary supervisor in order to renew my license? I think it could be very confusing for the person at that point and stymie them a bit,
And I
which
think
means they'll probably make a call to ask, why is the primary supervisor thing on there, which becomes a pain in the ass for staff.
And I think it might confuse whether or not I'm a primary supervisor for employment purposes versus a supervisor for,
That's a good point.
yeah, for SPE purposes. So yes, I supervise people because I hire people, I am a supervisor.
So maybe the way to get at it won't be through that, but will require something of primary supervisors to be sent into the board separately then.
Or a completely third option is when we're going through the random audit of licensees, we could ask, do you provide primary supervision to a psychological trainee? If yes, then we know that we're going to look for that supervision course.
But you could have somebody that for the renewal cycle was a primary supervisor for the first month, took the course 4 years ago, or whatever, at the end of the renewal cycle, or almost 4 years ago. They're not going to be putting forth the certificate as part of the CE they've done in this renewal cycle. It's actually from the past renewal cycle. Right?
And go ahead.
I was going to say correct, and I can see from the renewals coordinator perspective that wouldn't be an issue. You know, it could be tailored to the question of somehow of like what period were you providing supervision, or if you did provide supervision, when did it end, and then if you did 6 hours, when was it, and then, you know, some kind of a clarifying question of, you know, when did you take your training as opposed to when the supervision period took place, just so that way they could document somehow without even, I mean, and if they're required to keep it for 6 years, we could say, well, then show us that you did it
That's
X
true.
number of years ago or something like that.
That's
So,
true.
yeah, there's flexibility there.
Can I suggest something? It's just like a fourth option. Or
I think we're way beyond.
So, in the language that we propose here, we already said that evidence of completion of the course shall be submitted to the board upon request. How about we make that as a requirement? Because if they're sending in their VOE, I mean, like the trainees already sending in, the applicants already sending in the VOE, maybe an extra piece of paper to just require that, then we don't have to worry about the audit, because then we know for sure, okay, they did complete the supervisor did complete the course and from the get-go, so it should be good. It's just a thought.
So the verification of experience comes in at the end of time, and it's sent in by the licensee,
The verification.
or potential candidate for
Yes,
licensure.
yes, correct, by the applicant.
And so what you're suggesting is what? At that point in time, it comes from the,
So the course certificate or the evidence that the supervisor that signed off on the VOE
Paper
form,
Has
send it
to
in
be-
with the VOE, because right now the VOE has to be sent in a sealed envelope, so
Right.
it would be coming from the supervisor already. So then we know that, oh, okay, we see the VOE. we see
to the
course.
supervisee, and then the
Yes.
supervisee
To
can
submit
send it
that
into us.
application, Yeah. Then we don't have to worry about the auditing process. Just a thought.
So in theory, let's say someone has been supervising for a period of time. When you get that at VOE, you would just check to make sure that CPD has been within the last 2 years.
That,
Well, last 2 years, or would you, since they're supposed to retain it in this case for 6 years, would you want to see 3 pieces of evidence for it, or just the most
No,
recent?
just the most recent.
most recent.
I think they would need to show us the evidence for the period that they supervise, because when we
Right.
receive VOE, it doesn't mean that it's immediately the past 2 years. It could be like 10 years
That's
ago.
true. It
That's
could be,
interesting.
So
yeah.
it would be
So it
upon
would
them
have
to
to be
show
for the
us.
period of
Yes.
time.
So
But-
it would be it would be for their burden of proof to show us that they did complete it, and we don't have to pick and choose to see through all the course certificates or evidence that they submitted.
How likely would there be a situation where they've supervised someone for longer than 6 years? No, right?
Not
Okay,
likely.
just want to make sure that we don't accidentally.
Except for people that were kind of old on the psych assistant system, but
Yeah,
they're coming, they're
they're done
done,
as
yeah.
of October, yeah. So, I'm sorry?
They're not necessarily in control of when the applicant applies for licensure, and if they did supervise them some years ago beyond that 6-year period, and they said, hey, I kept it for 6 years, never heard from you guys, went in the shredder, they're not in control of when it's going to be required by the
Yeah.
board.
Oh, I thought the suggestion was maybe something different. Maybe I was misunderstood. I thought the suggestion was when they sign the verification of experience form, verifying the experience, they have to staple to the back of it the form that shows that they did the CE.
Is it then, though, an incomplete application if we don't get that?
Well,
I just want to
I don't know
think
if it should
about
be an incomplete.
any unintended consequences.
I don't know if it should be an incomplete application for the person that's applying, but I think it should give us cause to further investigate.
To contact the supervisor.
The supervisor.
I mean, we don't want to.
Yeah, I don't think that's the super, I mean, we can't ask the supervisees to ask.
I just want to
"Could
put
I see
that
proof?"
out there.
Yeah, no,
You
it's a
wanna-
good
No,
question.
you're right.
It's a good question.
It is a good question. We don't want to punish, the trainee. And,
Well, this would be a real sea change, because I think most people think of being kind of on the honor system now.
yeah.
And I don't know how rigorous people are about making sure they do it. I'm just going to do it as a regular course of things, because I do a lot of supervision.
And I don't want to think that we don't, what do I want to say? It's not that we don't trust people either. I mean, but it is, we have a requirement. Why do we have it if we're not actually using it,
Well, if
right?
there's no way of tracking it.
Exactly.
I
So
don't think it's that
either,
outrageous.
huh?
I don't think so.
I don't either. So, I mean, that's really more what it is, to my mind. It's like, we have this requirement, so let's either do something with it or don't have the requirement. I mean,
And for the benefit of licensees, I think when this requirement, when Pathways finally happens, this should be an area that we emphasize for purposes of supervisors.
Right.
Highlight for them, this is what you're going to be doing on a going forward basis, so they're not shocked by it.
Right. Totally.
Come on
agree.
up, Dr. Winkleman. You got a boo-boo face.
Well, I can see there's a lot of different options for the ways to do this.
No, you're not going to come up
Obviously.
with another.
No, I don't have a new option, actually. I haven't figured out. But in terms of, I understand Ms. Marsh's concern about mixing the apples and oranges of like, it's not a required CE for your license renewal, but I feel like if then you start putting it as part of the application for the trainee, then that feels like mixing apples and oranges. It feels like, okay, the trainees are going through so much to get their application prepared. If now they're in charge of making sure that or perceive that they're in charge of making sure that they have documentation that the supervisor completed their CE and supervision, to me, that feels like mixing apples and oranges, even though the requirement is related to the supervision. And I also was just thinking about that there are a lot of requirements for supervisors. This is one of them. And there's a long list and there's checklists that people have to sign and attest to that they're doing all these different things. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure the best way to do it, but I don't know that this needs to be monitored much more closely than everything else. You have a right to request it or audit it, but I don't know that you need to receive every piece of paper for every single person. So I just feel like I'd be hesitant to implement something where then it appears to be a requirement on the trainee side.
In our,
Good point, really good point, huh?
in our sea of options, going back to Ms. Sorik's option, what was the potential issue there with including it as a part of the random audit? Is that when they get contacted for a random audit, we ask the question, have you been a primary supervisor? Did we discuss that through, and were there any concerns with that, or what was the issue with not doing that?
What was one of the options? I don't know that there was an issue.
Oh, okay, it wasn't resolved, okay. Because that seems to make the most.
I think Dr. Phillips had talked about people would be confused and think that was a requirement of licensure.
If you put it on a licensing renewal application.
No, this is not for licensing renewal, this is when you're being randomly
This is the
audited.
one that Jason was talking about. There could be a series of questions to discern whether to check to make sure people had paperwork. that
Oh,
showed-
you mean at the audit time,
Yeah.
if they're picked
If they're
to
picked
be
to be audited.
audited, perfect, yeah.
It might be the most practical way to do it. I think there could be some confusion on the part of potential or future licensees as to whether their verification of experience form would be valid without the certificate attached to it, and that shouldn't really be their responsibility.
Right.
Otherwise, you'd have to say for the instruction purposes, if the supervisor fails to provide that, it's not on you to make sure that it
Right,
happens.
right.
And it is kind of a little
But it's
confused.
an anxious time and people don't always hear.
No, they don't read
when-
instructions.
Now, if
When
we,
you're anxious or emotional, you don't hear easily. Yes,
now if we follow through this suggestion of going through at the time of random audit, then we would want to then go back to Dr. Wickelman's concern about the 6 versus 4 years, right? We would want to standardize, since if we go through option SORIC, we'll give it the title, then we'll want to make sure that it's the same 4 years for both the regular CPD and the supervisorial CPD.
that totally makes sense because at the time of the audit, if we ask that question during the audit, during this time, then we'll have the information, so.
So you'd say, have you been a primary
we can make
supervisor
it
during this
4 years.
period? And then if there isn't a supervisory form in there, you could ask, could you show that you did the course at the beginning,
Yeah,
within 2 years of the completion of it?
that's really good.
If I could add to the committee, I am trying to, Ms. Burns apologizes for not being here, but she is watching and providing some commentary, so I'm just trying to flesh out her feedback. So I apologize if it's taking me a little bit of time, but
No problem.
she does have concerns regarding implementing it within the audit process, but I'm just trying to flesh out how to
She
best.
does?
She does, but I'm just working on how to best relate that to the committee.
One thing that we could do as part of the pathways process is bring to the committee what this contact letter would look like if you were selected for audit, and the verbiage we would use to identify if you are a primary supervisor of a psychological trainee, and to see, because we want to make sure, not just from a staff perspective, but from a stakeholder and a committee perspective, that what we're asking for is clear and connected with the current requirements. And then also that it makes sense to tie it in with the current audit process.
I can see, though, where we're having such challenges with getting people to actually respond to the audit and then to provide us the proof of their CE, that this becomes yet another step and another thing that has to be followed up on. It might be very hard for the renewals coordinator. So I'd want her feedback, I think, before we ever did anything.
Well, I think that's what Ms. Sork is suggesting, that maybe we table this for right now and ask staff to come back with some recommendations for how we can ensure that primary supervisors are getting this thing.
Yep.
Okay? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to move on from this topic, this particular aspect of the topic, and.
So just for follow-up, for purposes of the next meeting and for follow-up for the minutes, that we will have the renewals and continuing education coordinator prepare a document that will lay out if the committee would like to move forward with including this as part of the audit, the current audit process, what would be the implications of that, and then what would the contact letter look like where we would have people identify whether or not they are a primary supervisor?
Correct.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. All right, so now we are moving along to, we've basically scratched out patient and left client everywhere. And so let's move to page 490 is the next one I have. And this is about general applied psychology. Basically saying in these areas, if the primary supervisor is not licensed, then they must have a co-supervisor who is. Okay, we agree? Okay.
I'm sorry, what page are you on, Dr. Horn?
490. We're accepting what's highlighted there in yellow. Now, you've changed some of the, so you may be off a little bit right now. Okay. But it's Part C,
It's confusing. Isn't it?
pathways to, well, let's see, there's 7E, 8F, or 7, 8, and then
Oh,
9.
yes, yes.
Do you see it? And then C. Do you see it?
Is it that right there? Is that
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we are okay. We like it. Okay. We like it. All right, continuing along.
Here's 25 of 35.
Huh?
25 of 35 is the next highlighted section.
25 of 35, okay.
By that-
It's not on mine.
It's just a comma. It's a comma on line 15.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Y'all okay with that comma?
Yeah, it's a really good comment.
Oh, Dr. Winkleman
No,
isn't.
it's not about the comma.
Oh.
I wanted to know if I could make if I could ask a question about the previous page, 496.
Mhm.
Because I'm interested and wanted to get some clarification about 1387.4, because an issue has come up recently with psychology trainees in federal prisons. So they're not in a military installation, but federal prison training sites who are being supervised by psychologists who are not licensed in California, but were licensed in another state
Right.
and were as part of an APA accredited program. So I'm wondering if this is something that could perhaps be addressed in a clear way in revising 1387.4, because if I read this correctly in section B, it sounds like the SPE can be accrued within any federal agency, which I believe would include the federal prison.
Right, and the VA, which was also,
And the
has come
VA,
up.
right.
Yeah. Mhm.
But if that's going to be the case, I would just want it to be clarified and perhaps a suggestion in the title, change of the title of the regulations, because right now it says experience accrued outside of California, so it would need to.
Or within a federal agency?
Yeah,
Yes.
that would be good.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that, I believe that if I'm understanding the changes correctly, it would address that issue.
Yeah, that would. Thanks.
Quick question on that. So if the facility was a privately contracted facility, would that still fall under the federal agency category that we're using?
Like what? What do you mean?
Oh,
A private prison?
Yeah.
Mhm.
yeah.
Would we consider that as falling under the definition of federal agency?
The federal government doesn't use private prisons.
Yeah.
State
Yeah.
government uses,
Yeah.
sometimes we'll send people to,
Yeah.
federal government just builds another prison.
Okay.
They've got the
So
printing
answer's
press.
no. Okay. Okay, so I think this is clear. I mean, that's how we're moving, but apparently we don't allow that right now. Is that correct? Okay. So thank you, Dr. Winkleman. All right, we're continuing to move along here. Okay, here we go. Page 499. Satisfaction of licensure requirements. We talked about it earlier in conjunction with something else, but I think we want to go to 2 years. That's
2
what-
years in any jurisdiction? I thought we were going 2 years for another state. Now we're going 2 years.
It says another state, Canadian province, or U.S. territory.
Okay.
And I think that's what the last one was as
Okay.
well.
I was somehow thinking it was subsuming other countries, although most other countries don't even have a licensing law. So.
Right. Right, oh, and their level of training isn't what ours is, and blah, blah, blah.
So for those that may have just joined us on the webcast, what staff will do is prepare the pathways language as currently drafted, as amended, and present it to the EPPP2 task force for review and discussion, and then it will go back to the board. So that we incorporate both because what we're doing is pulling out the examination sections of the
Right.
statutes and the regs.
But not the entire pathways going to task forces.
No, just,
not for those.
no, just the
All the stuff
examination
with
sections.
exams.
Right.
Mhm.
Yes, but what we will do is we will also present the task force with the changes that this committee has already reviewed and considered, so that they can also provide input and feedback, so that they're not getting just existing language and then starting over from scratch. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
good. But I think we wanted to go 2 years,
2 years.
not 5
Okay.
years. Okay, so we did that earlier and submit documentation of a passing score.
Not 2 years.
Yeah. Okay, 1390 is going away, right?
A lot of that's going on.
Okay. Right, that's all the,
Several sections.
yeah, several sections. So do we go to 1391.1?
Sorry, quick question.
Yeah.
When we say going away, it's just going to show up as a strike through for all these sections?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
One moment, if in 1388.6, there was a second question, LN6.
What page are you
Oh,
on?
I'm sorry, it's not in my, yeah, it's on page
Oh, I see it.
499, LN7.
So at this point, the answer is yes. The EPPP's been in existence since 1963. And prior to our adopting the recommended pass point, we had a pass point. So I think, every state had its own pass point kind of. So I think it would have to have been consistent with our pass point, right?
And that's what
At
the
the-
language
yeah.
suggests, that they submit documentation of a passing score.
Right.
And the passing score could be what, if it was historical, the passing score could be whatever score was used in the state in which they
Where
were
they were
licensed.
licensed.
So we're not asking them to meet our,
Right,
right, just to make that clear.
right.
Okay.
Okay. We're fine with the way it is.
Does that address that?
Do you want, the language is not correct then, if you're saying the answer is yes, so we should either, staff should change it or we should change it right now?
Oh, shall not be required, that's
Right.
Shall be
Oh,
required.
Oh, shall be, yeah.
I mean, it's a whole.
This whole section is on the, on waiver or satisfaction of licensure requirements, which I think the committee just said earlier was going to kind of look at separately. So I'm just wondering if we should spend a lot of time on these particular sections.
We're making our recommendation, if you're talking about the examination part.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we're making our recommendations to them, but then this is going to get pulled out. That's my understanding.
And then they're going to have their
And they'll
recommendations.
have their recommendations, and we'll,
But I think that if you were making your recommendation to take out that paragraph about waiver, then I'm wondering why you would need this paragraph at all.
what now?
If in 2946, which we discussed earlier, you were considering what you wanted to do about that one paragraph about waiving the exam, this whole section is based on 2946, particularly that one section, that one paragraph about waiver. So I'm wondering why we want to wordsmith now when you might end up deleting the whole section.
Well, this isn't only about the exam, this is about the CPQ and stuff like that. I'm not sure what you're saying.
Noreen, are you just recommending the removal of A or new A?
I'm confused.
Well, except though, I get that, except that the difference seems to be, the change that this seems to be making with respect to those applicants is that you don't need to tell us about the EPPP, which presumes that you don't care about the EPPP. And I'm just not sure if you want to go that route, since you're considering saying, we always want to know about the EPPP. So whether or not 1388.6 becomes somewhat irrelevant if you're not going to talk about either waiver the exam or we're going to just trust that you did it, that you always want to see it, and then potentially 1388.6 becomes somewhat irrelevant.
Oh, I see what you're saying. We don't have to keep adding it everywhere. If we say in the earlier section that we always want documentation.
Right,
is
if
what
you're
saying.
potentially going to look at amending 2946, the statute, to remove any reference to waiver of the exam, or you're not sure if you either ever want to waive it, which I understood that the committee would not be recommending, or you want to simply trust that it's been taken and never want to ask for documentation, then does this become somewhat irrelevant? If you're saying we
don't want to just
trust that a person who holds a CPQ has taken and successfully passed the EPPP, then you could, I guess, keep talking about any of these. You could say this is not essentially about waiving the EPPP, this is about, you don't need to document to us because we trust that you've taken it. Then you can keep wordsmithing, but if it's about, we don't really care if you show us because we don't really care if you've taken it because you have other sort of indications that you have met minimum qualifications, then yeah, by all means, then we can wordsmith this. Otherwise, I'm not entirely sure if you want to spend the time wordsmithing this now until you decide what you want to do about either waiver of the exam or waiver of the documentation of the exam.
So the larger
if you
policy
understand it.
issue is, do we ever want to waive seeing passing scores on the exam?
Right.
And I think that's what we need to discuss, but it would need to be discussed in the context of the prior section we were talking about too.
That's my thought, yes, that
So for example, if we look at the CPQ, the CPQ includes documentation. I mean, you don't get a CPQ, for example, unless you've taken and passed the EPPP. That's an example because that's the only piece we're adding here, right? I don't know about the National Register, what their requirements,
yeah,
what their requirement is.
The other thing I just want to point out, and this was just from being able to attend ASPBB a couple weeks ago, is we talked about Puerto Rico already. Also, Quebec does not require the EPPP, so we want to make sure
It does
that.
for if you're trained outside of that province.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, but that may or may not change in the
Right.
future. So you may not want to take away your ability to look at something if things in Canadian provinces or U.S. territories change. It's just
Right.
something to consider.
I like that, yeah.
Okay.
And, I think the ABAP too typically the ABAPs now require that you've taken the EPPP and got licensed that way.
Right.
But they also grandfather people in usually when they start a new ABAP that may have been licensed for a much longer period of time. I'm sure the EPPP's been around for a long time. But I'm just not feeling comfortable unless we know
Well,
that they,
then let's leave it in. That's fine.
I think what they need, all
Yeah.
need to take the exam. And
I
show-
agree.
And give us
Yeah.
proof of the fact that they got a passing score in the state they were taking
Yeah,
it from.
wherever they took it, yeah. So we're okay. We're not going to wordsmith it. The only thing we're wordsmithing is changing from 5 to 2.
So, for each of the
Right.
different sections, it does say shall not be required to submit. Would you want us to look at shall be required to
Yeah.
submit then for
Submit a
each of the different
passing
categories?
score.
Okay.
Yep.
Mhm.
And again, just a reminder, we will bring this language back to the EPPP2 task force, and then it will come again before the board once the task force has reviewed the language.
Right. Okay.
If you're gonna require them, I'm not quite sure then what A does for any particular applicant.
What?
I'm sorry, then I'm not entirely sure if you've deleted not, then what does A do for that applicant?
What does A do?
Sub A. So what does that?
It says that you don't have to, it says that if you've been licensed 2 years,
Mhm.
and we have proof that you've been licensed 2 years, just show us your passing score on the EPPP.
But it doesn't sound
that-
that way.
But why, so then why do you need that at all? Why wouldn't they be required to show you their passing score? It's a qualification for licensure. I guess I'm not quite sure what that adds.
I think you're right. I think originally we added it because we actually waived that before, and then we found out that everybody hadn't passed the EPPP, and we were accepting them for licensure because there was nothing in there that said they had to do that. So they had a doctorate, they had the educational requirements, say, but hadn't passed the exam.
So I think I'm going to go back a little bit to 2946, the section where you were recommending change of the statute, where you're recommending changing the 5 years to 2 years. And I guess I'm wondering, what then is an applicant not required to establish? What does that give them? And what is the board then
We
not
don't have to
asking for?
get their letters from their supervisors or things like that we now have to get.
Okay.
So it makes the process of licensure, I think, a little bit easier in terms of all those kinds of things, right? They also have to take the one-time continuing
Complete.
education things,
Well, they still
too.
have to do the
Yeah.
complete
Well,
and
the
one-time
actually-
education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the complete.
Yeah, that's a slightly different. Okay, so 2946 requires that they still take the C plea,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not requiring, are you requiring their transcripts or evidence of their degree? So you're not, potentially, so you're not requiring that,
If they've been licensed at the doctoral level,
okay?
I think we don't require that.
We have been asking for those.
You have?
Under
transcripts.
2946, because all it says is if the licensing requirements are substantially equivalent to the requirements of the psychology licensing law. So they have to take the C plea. They
have to
have
take
to
those
establish
courses.
They
their
have to take those courses.
doctoral degree. They have to still take the one-time courses,
Uh-huh.
but they don't need the SPE.
Right.
So essentially, 2946 waives the SPE. Is that,
Yeah.
okay.
So let me, now that this has kind of opened up another thing, right now 17 states don't require postdoc.
Right.
So what do we do about that? I mean, if they're licensed, they've been licensed for 2 years, can they not get licensed here if they haven't had a postdoc but are educated to the doctoral degree? Because our requirements are postdoc. This is part of the problem with changing things like that.
I find this whole process a bit problematic
Yeah.
in the sense that I think we should be having sections that specifically say, if you're in these circumstances, this is what you need to give us,
Okay.
period. Because these were originally as exemptions.
Right.
To
Right.
kind of reverse the
Right.
exemptions doesn't really speak to what really needs to be done.
Right.
So I don't even know why we'd even have this language at all, as long as we spelled out
I
somewhere
think that's
what was required.
But I understand what you're saying.
Legal
now.
minds
I didn't
don't know.
understand what she was saying. You've had enough of the psychology.
That's right.
Okay, but now that
I'm the
makes
bridge.
sense.
So if 2946 essentially is a waiver of the SPE, if it's considered substantially equivalent if they don't require a postdoc, I guess this is just saying, hey, we're still going to ask for the EPPP? And I guess I'm not sure why you would be doing that, why they wouldn't have to.
Because substantial equivalence would include the EPPP, right? I mean, is that what you're saying?
That's, yeah, because if they still have to show
I think we're going to have
substantial
to
equivalency.
specify what substantial equivalence means for staff, because,
I think we need to make this like it's a checklist for the
Yeah.
person who's getting licensed. It's a
yeah,
checklist for staff.
yeah,
This is, all feels very kind of,
yeah,
Vague
substantial
and-
equivalence, I
Yeah,
don't
so,
like.
so I guess I'm not sure why you'd be going from, you're not required to submit it, to now, we're just going to tell you you are, and my thinking is, well, why wouldn't they be?
Right, because we've already said you got to do it.
Right.
You're going to be licensed.
It,
So-
it might be helpful if we just look at in-state applications or something, and then out-of-state or U.S. or Canadian territory or something, where we understand the requirements. Let's say overwhelmingly in those areas, we know that there is an exam, that our board audits, that we can verify test competence, so that we separate, sorry, I'm looking to Ms. Chung, so that we separate the requirements to be kind of our regular application, and then just another section that says, if you are an out-of-state or U.S. or Canadian territory, these are the requirements for providing
documentation.
for licensure. And then we say, here's the, SPE, exemption, and then provide documentation of EPPP passing score. I'm just
We could do
thinking
two
out
lists,
loud, sorry
what
if
they
this
don't
isn't
need to
making
provide and what
sense.
they do need to provide.
Right.
So it's almost like our step-by-step instruction on our website right now.
Yeah.
We have like the regular in-state applicant and then the instruction for out-of-state applicant in different scenarios, like they have never been licensed, they have been licensed for 5 years or less, they have been licensed for 5 years or more, and then they have CPQ, ABAB, and National registration, and see what they are, and to present to the committee for consideration. Perfect, yeah, no problem. We can do that.
Yeah, can you guys bring it
Okay,
back as a?
yeah,
as
that would be
I
good.
don't know if it's multiple sections or it's one big, long section or what it is, but.
We're creating a new reg section that
Look how
basically
she
deals
perked up
with
when she heard chart.
everyone that's not a California
charts.
applicant.
With
That's
bar
what we're
diagrams.
doing. It's just a step-by-step, what are we looking
Yeah.
for if you
Yeah.
are an out-of-state or Canadian or U.S. territory applicant?
Right, and there would be a difference between somebody who was trained out of state and is applying for licensure for the first time in California versus licensed out of state, right?
Yeah.
Within that context, I think we can have the discussion about the states that are now trending in one direction relative to what constitutes acceptable supervised professional experience, and the ones that have stayed in a more traditional direction. I don't think they're equivalent, personally. But we're also talking about mostly people that have been practicing for a while since then, for 2 years.
Yeah.
So they've got 2 years postdoctoral experience. Even if
Yeah, but it wasn't, yeah.
it might not be supervised experience,
Right.
but at least we know they've got some experience beyond their
Right,
doctorate
right.
in applying the
And they haven't
material.
gotten in trouble. or-
Right, exactly.
So, which they're
Um,
not going to in 2
yeah.
years, usually.
Because I don't think anybody's proposing that we move in that direction, at least not at this point.
In reflecting on, I think, public comment earlier today about the complexity of our multiple pathways, I think it's, at some point, thinking about a way where someone can click through in my head where you start through and you hit yes or no, and it just guides.
Flowchart?
Yeah, a flow chart that moves with you. I think in an ideal, wow, I got the. But I do, I mean, not now, because we're still in the process of crafting what these pathways look like, but looking to the future, if there's an ease by which someone who's interested and says, hey, I'm finishing my bachelor's degree and want to be a
They
psychologist.
could even go down one route and say, well, I'm not going to qualify that way, let me back up and see
Right.
if I can.
Right, right.
So I think just thinking further along the lines and getting you primed up for your chart-making experience, that we think about how we can make the navigation piece easier, because we are creating many options. And we're also in some places closing options. And so to that, as those changes take effect eventually, we should think about how to make that available and accessible.
But I do think it's the committee's sentiment at this point that we want proof of EPPP passing score for every category. Correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I just want to make sure I'm on the same page.
Yeah. Okay? All right. So y'all, staff is going to
Is that
bring
good?
back stuff. Thank you.
So with that said, we're not going to, if I understand correctly, engage in a lot of wordsmithing around this, because eventually we may say, we don't need it because why wouldn't you?
Right, right.
It's a requirement for licensure,
Right.
right?
Right.
Right.
So we're just moving
Moving right along.
in a particular direction, right? Okay, so now the next few sections we are going to be deleted, struck through, because they're about what we're a registered psychologist.
All the 1390 sections.
Yeah. Well, isn't 1391.1, is that,
No, I'm just saying,
Yeah, all-
1390,
yeah,
and then
okay.
all the related sections right there.
So now 1391.9, registration period, this is for psych assistants, right?
Wait, what?
1391.1, page 502.
Right.
May apply for registration as a psych assistant. So we may need to change that section number if we're rolling. I mean, there may be some other numbers changes, I'm not sure, but because of the
Staff has
registered
had,
psychologist stuff.
yeah, we've had multiple conversations about going through all of our right packages at the very end and tidying up all the numbers
Okay.
and sections and references
All
and
right.
everything. It'll be,
Okay. All right, we okay with this? About who do you register with and all that?
I still have concerns about the 60 months as opposed to the 72 months within the context of a psychological assistant registration. And I think we're going to get a lot of public feedback about that, which will be great. Maybe there's even a way we can solicit that now. But it does compact the period in which they have to accumulate their hours. And many people feel already kind of pushed to try to get that accomplished and live life and do whatever else they do to. So I just want to say that it's a question mark in my mind whether that's a good idea or not. But for our purposes right now, it's fine.
Okay.
Quick question.
Yeah.
The strikeout on line 39 of that page, does that mean this committee wouldn't be hearing extension requests anymore?
No, we
Or is that-
always do, but I can't remember why we took this out. We've given staff some parameters for considering this and going ahead and moving folks along and when to bring it to us, but I don't remember why we scratched out this wording in particular.
Somewhere else?
Did it appear somewhere?
No, I think this was one of the staff recommendations that the committee agreed with or didn't have any questions or concerns about, and it could have just been an oversight because it's toward the end and could have been
I think
the
we have
end of the day.
questions. I think we do need the flexibility to be able to do that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think
Yeah.
we should get rid of that process.
Yeah.
Because there are good reasons that this
Oh,
happens
of
to people.
course, yeah.
There are also bad reasons it happens to people. But people should have an opportunity to plead their
Yeah.
case, I think.
Dr. Winkleman?
Yeah, that was my comment. I think it's important that there be some flexibility, recognizing that there are going to be cases, as you said. And at that point, of course, a person may have devoted 7 years of their life to the training, may have done nothing wrong and gotten sick or had to care for a
Right.
relative or something like that. And also, so if there's flexibility, this is less of an issue. But what is the I'm wondering, because I think you will get feedback about the 6 to 5 years. And I'm wondering what is the rationale for going from 6 to 5 years?
So the original 6 years was to take folks who were psych assistants at the time and give them essentially as long as kind of the average amount of time and a little bit longer than it takes for people to get through a doctoral program. But all of our other categories, pre and postdoc, are 30 months for each part, for each 1,500 hours. So that's why we moved it to 60 months to be consistent with our other categories, pre and postdoc. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would say that I think the reason why there may be some feedback is that if you're in one of these other settings, it's more formalized, and the people can get the regular hours, whereas if somebody's a psych assistant, they may have to switch to a different supervisor, a different setting. They may not have enough hours of work to give that person. So I think it can be different and can be longer and not necessarily due to the fault of the psychological.
So one of the things that we do allow, and we'll educate people about this as well, is that people can toll their psych assistantship if they're between supervisors. And, I mean, so there are things that people can do so that it doesn't take away from them. And again, I'm going to say, at this point in time, it's always, if there is a good reason, the board will definitely take a look at it.
I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
So thank you that you have that discretion to review an individual petition.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, at the end of that page, 1391.2, by the board.
If I can say one quick.
Yeah.
Real quick, no, that's, sorry for interrupting. Just a real quick plug. That in prior committee meetings, we have discussed an inactive psych assistant registration status, and I would just kind of do an additional plug for, especially because there is the concern about the 72 to 60 month requirement, that if we had the function of someone being able to call and put their registration on inactive status, that would stop the clock in our system. It's not certainly a requirement. They could do that now by letting us know that their registration is stopped, and they're not allowed to practice, but if we had an inactive status, it would just make it a cleaner process for us to be able to track that time in our licensing system. And I hate to sound bureaucratic in putting this on our licensing system, but it certainly is not punitive towards the psych assistant if they can easily have a mechanism to do that.
And the more efficient our processes are, the better job we can do processing things in a timely fashion. When we get lost in having to calculate these things out without there being some mechanical way of doing it, it becomes a much more difficult thing. It does slow down the process. And we want to be as timely as we can possibly be in being responsive to people when they finally want to get licensed.
And actually, right now, some of the requests for extension we're getting is because people have been without supervisors for a period of time, and they have run up against the clock, and they didn't let us know, and probably weren't aware to let us know and all like that. So what can we do about that to help people know? And
So
Yeah.
if I can ask the committee to possibly add to the next committee agenda to look at some draft language for the inactive psych assistant registration
Perfect, yeah.
as just a follow-up to our discussion today.
That'd be really good. Okay, thanks. All right, y'all, it's almost 3 o'clock. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back at 3 o'clock, actually. We are almost done. Start it again. Our 10 minutes is up. Where's Ms. Marks?
She's in the hallway.
Okay, we'll go ahead and start. Okay. So now we're on page 503, 1391.5. The question there is, this is about supervision, and this is primary supervisor again, so we do want to take out board certified psychiatrist. I think everything else is okay on that page. Okay. Page 504, supervisor's responsibility. Have education, training, and experience, areas of psychological practice for which they'll supervise, responsible for supervising the psychological functions performed by the psych assistant, and ensure that the psychological assistant complies with provisions of the code, the board's regulations, and the ethical standards. Okay.
I think we did this in another section, but I'm wondering if we should refer to leave it as is as the ethical standards established by the American Psychological Association, or if we should put it in as the actual title of, and it's perfect timing, Ms. Marks. We're under the section for supervisor's responsibility, and we reference the ethical standards established by APA, and I'm wondering if we need to put in the title of the code of ethics.
Code of conduct.
The code of conduct, whatever it's a long title. Should we?
Code of conduct and ethical principles.
Should we
and
put in
code
the
of
actual
conduct.
title or leave it in as ethical standards established by the APA?
Well, you could
Well,
also.
you know, well,
Dr. Phillips, were you going to say something?
an attorney that I've talked to who's a regulatory expert attorney said that we shouldn't put in the professional association even, but we should say ethical standards established by the profession and not list.
I think he was referencing if we established our own ethical code and not using an association's ethical code. Because if we didn't refer to APA's ethical code, then we wouldn't have any ethical code to refer to. And when we're doing enforcement cases, we always refer to violations
Yeah.
of the APA Code of Ethics.
Well, he's actually talked about the other two, but
Oh, okay.
yeah.
I actually-
Not not saying the profession, the guilds.
So because the APA ethical principles of psychologists and the code of conduct is in statute. So I guess the question is whether or not you actually need it in reg. It says the board shall adopt a program, consumer and professional education. This is section 2936, page 112 of the Orange Book. The board shall establish as its standards of ethical conduct relating to the practice of psychology, the ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct published by the APA. These standards shall be applied by the board as the accepted standard of care in all licensing, examination, development, and all board enforcement policies and disciplinary case evaluations. So
if we just say APA here, where in statute it's already spelled out, do we need to spell it out here?
We just refer back to the statute here?
We just say
As
in the codes-
established
in the
in
code and
statute.
regulations.
the only question, was there a difference between the principles and the standards or something? Were there actually two different publications by the APA?
No, it's all
Okay, is it? For some
one
reason I thought there
publication.
was
Part of
like-
It's got a long title.
Part of it is aspirational,
That's the principles.
the
Oh, the
principles.
principles, okay.
And then the code of conduct is the more ethical rules, so to speak.
But the whole the whole document is called that. It's got the two parts.
The reason I like it in here,
The full-out name.
the full-out name, is we're telling the supervisor what they need to make sure the person's complying with. So it's giving direction to the supervisor as to what they need to look at. They need to look at the code, they need to look at the regulations, they need to look at the ethical principles and standards
Right,
of conduct.
right.
So,
I'm sorry.
so I think it's more directive in this sense, and it gives them more guidance, as opposed to saying, oh, look at the codes and regulations, and by the way, without saying it, we incorporate in the regulations the code of conduct. I'd rather have it spelled out so people knew what exactly what they're
Right, and this is specific as to the supervisor's responsibility, whereas the statute refers to licensing, examination, development, and all board enforcement policies and disciplinary case evaluations. So, the only issue with changing the name or putting the name in right now is that I don't know if it has a publication date.
It does,
Then every time that changes, the reg will have to change.
because we don't typically, you could not put the publication date in here, but it would only reference the code at that point in time,
Right, well, more importantly,
or the
oh, wait,
regulations.
well,
yes.
So if we just say
we'll
standards
want a
established by
publication
the
date.
APA, that tells us it's the current code, right?
So maybe we're better off saying the ethical standards?
Well, I think one of the issues will be that once, if you open it up and you put in the specific title and revision date, then you're just going to have to keep
Keep changing
updating
it.
it.
Well, then why don't we just leave it like it is?
Yeah.
APA. I mean,
Are there other
Everybody-
standards, are there other standards other than ethical standards that the APA establishes? Do we need to indicate
Well, they
ethical
put out,
standards?
they put out papers that are advisories about what you should do in
They're
particular
they put
areas.
out guidelines.
Yeah,
but they're not ethical standards. They're
No, they're not.
guidelines. And the only other standards right now that they have are the standards of accreditation, and that's obviously
relevant.
not appropriate or relevant for this. So I think the others are called guidelines.
right.
Yeah.
So maybe it's better to leave it this way.
Mhm.
I don't have a problem referring to the American Psychological Association in this context, because they are the national association that sets these
That's right,
standards,
yeah.
and they're the only ones that really do
Right.
it.
I have no
Whereas
problem either. on
within
this. Yeah.
other licensed disciplines, they've got an American ethical code, they've got a California ethical code, they got, they've got, there's more disparate codes, so.
If you were to bring an action against a supervisor, really anyone, for violation, you'd probably still have expert testimony that would refer to what the standards are here in California, but would most likely still be relying in large part on the APA
Right.
standards, I
Right,
would
right,
guess.
Right. Right, exactly.
Some of the ethical standards are geographically contextual. So the ethical standards may change if you're living in a tiny little town in the middle of Alaska, as opposed to living in Los Angeles, because the standard of care changes within that context. And the possibility of dual relationships becomes greater, and so on and so forth. By and large, I think this covers the grounds without us having to.
Well, it totally does, and except for sex with clients or patients, everything in the ethical code, I think, is pretty much about ethical reasoning.
Right.
So it's like.
And context.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and context,
Yeah.
so, yeah. All righty.
Mine is more technical. I believe we had a conversation earlier about board being not capitalized.
That's in statute,
Oh,
not
in statute.
regulation.
Yeah.
In regulations, we capitalize, in statutes, we
capitalize,
don't.
yeah.
Never mind.
I finally learned that rule after 5 years. Yeah. We're the big B board.
Okay, so let's continue to read through these. We're keeping it like it is, all the suggestions, and then
It looks good.
blah, blah, blah. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this page is okay, as is. Now we go to the next page, 505. Incorporate annual update form by reference. Okay, that's a note to staff, from staff. So an
So
update
the
for
regulation
this.
should include the actual update form? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Okay. And this is what it has to include. All right, and we will have a form for them to do, and that will be the correct form. Okay. All right, next page, 506. Attestation that the supervisor, this is part of the form. Okay, failure to submit a completed annual update shall ineligible for renewal.
Really quick, then, this is just a technical update. I'm wondering if, since in the statute, we refer to electronic mailing address, if we use that verbiage instead of email address in the regs. In our change of address statute, it's, line 38 on page 505. It says name, license number, telephone number, and email address. So just to make it consistent with our statute, to say electronic mailing address.
Great. And I think I saw email somewhere else in here, I don't remember, but maybe that's another thing just to make sure, yeah. Okay, back to 506.
Dr. Winkleman.
Thank you. Dr. Winkleman?
This may already be covered in the updates. I'm just wondering, is there anywhere where it's clear that you can have more than one primary supervisor and more than one location in which you're getting your hours? Is there
Yeah.
anything in the regulation that would clarify that?
The statute.
Because like in 1391.11, it says within 30 days after the termination of the supervision. Anyway, I was just wondering if this might be a good opportunity to make sure that that's clear.
So you're asking if we should add in clarifying language?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I mean, something very brief, but just so, because some things that I've read, it makes it sound like you can have one primary supervisor, but my understanding is you can have more than one.
You can have more than one.
Right.
And isn't it somewhere? I mean,
Yeah, it's no specific provisions about the way it's going to work now with the one number.
I think maybe on the website there is something about the one number, but even then, I don't know if it's clear that if it can be concurrent and not necessarily sequential.
For some reason, I feel like this shows up somewhere,
I
Yeah, I
found
do
the,
Yes.
Ms. Chung found the.
but I'm not sure where.
this is-
I don't even know where I am right now.
Yeah, no kidding.
So if I So on 502, the section 1391.1, so the last line, we kind of the first paragraph, subsection A, we kind of instruct the applicant to submit like a form on another form if they're applying for more than one primary supervisor. Would that suffice?
I'm sorry, I don't see.
Okay,
which
it's in
is
part
page
A.
502?
Yeah, page 502, line 30th.
I've highlighted
29.
it blue-ish.
If
Yeah.
if applying
I
for a
see.
registration with more than one
Right.
supervisor,
Okay,
the person
thank you.
shall also
Thank you.
submit. Yeah, okay.
Sounds good.
All right, now we go back to 506, I think. Thanks, Dr. Winkleman, and thanks, Ms. Chung, for getting us to where it is. All right, I think we're at 1391.11. Just kind of keep looking and see to make sure. Now we're at 1391.12. Okay, I think we already did this, didn't we?
In the statute, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. And you just have a note to yourself to incorporate by reference to.
yeah.
So we can
Oh, and
leave-
this
we
is
can
where
leave that
we're
to later.
saying electronic mail, right? So, on 507, right there, telephone number and email, so there's another place. Okay,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just pointed out another email, if we're saying electronic. What did we say?
What page are you on? 507?
507, number 4, right at the top of the page. Yeah.
Is the email supposed to be hyphenated?
No.
This is one of my great questions in life.
What,
It,
electronic mailing address is what we're going to say? Okay,
it used to be.
yeah.
AP style was E-mail, and then it switched to
Okay.
one word.
Okay, well, it's good to know. Now I can
It
stop
was.
wondering.
You can stop worrying about that.
I'll find something else to worry about.
Okay, and then if a registration hasn't been renewed within 60 days after its expiration, it's done. Okay? Now we're on, moving right along.
Which is cool.
Yeah. Is that it? We have no more?
Oh, Lordy.
I don't believe it.
How efficient you are.
We got through a lot today.
We did.
So, just for follow-up, there were a couple of areas where we needed to provide the committee with some additional information. On the supervisors, the 6-hour course, we're going to bring that back. We're also going to bring back, remind me, Ms. Chung? And the out-of-state, and then also to bring back the inactive psychological assistant registration. And so what we can do is, everything else we'll unhighlight for you for the next time. And then we'll highlight the areas where there was follow-up for staff to bring back to the committee. And then the hope will be, so let's see, the next licensing committee meeting is in October? So then we would, our goal would be to, at the November board meeting, we would present pathways to licensure to the board.
By then, we'll have the feedback from the PPP2 task force also?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, good.
This is just a general comment. I really appreciated the numbering on the electronic agenda. So there was this, on the big packet, it was all the 533 pages, but also on the breakouts, the numbering was the same, so that you could use either and reference both. So really, I appreciate, just as a form follows function kind of philosophy, this was really helpful to follow along throughout the process.
Natasha did that.
And
Thank you.
Although I had not discovered it until perhaps too late in the day, I also appreciated the tabs. I now know how to find them by going to the bookmark thing.
Yeah.
There we go. That's very cool. So thank you very much. It really makes it so much easier, and if I'd been paying attention, I would have done that last night.
Okay, so is there anything else that we need to look at based on this? We're all done with this, right? Okay, so, I mean, for today. I mean, I don't mean, for heaven's sakes, I don't mean we're all done.
So just agenda items for future.
Okay, thank you. Before we go into closed session and adjourn the open part of the meeting, let me ask, are there any agenda items for future licensing committee meetings? Seeing none, I had one that you and I talked about. Oh, the supervision course, so we already talked about that, okay, great.
And Ms.
So-
Sork, you had a suggestion for the next agenda, but have we already included that in our list of things?
The inactives
Oh,
psych
okay, so
assistant.
that was just the inactive,
It was
okay.
that and just the supervision course.
So, Ms. Chung, would you read what we've said that's going on for the next time, just so that we know?
So we're gonna bring back a suggestion regarding the 6-hour supervision course and how does
Do
it
you
gonna
need to
look.
talk in the mic?
Yeah.
Look at the mic. Okay, I'll just stand up.
You want to sit here?
It's okay. Oh, thank you. So the next time we're gonna, staff is gonna bring back, how is it gonna look like regarding the 6-hour supervision course and relay out any suggestions that we have. And then we're gonna prepare regulation sections that talked about specifically how in-state application, what are the requirements versus like out-of-state applications, what are the requirements for them to submit, and what documents are needed. And then also bring back the inactive status regulations. We probably will have language ready and any relevant information for the committee to consider for a psych assistant.
Okay, great, thanks. And it looks like we might have another suggestion for future agendas. Dr. Winkleman?
I just had one final question. I was hoping that the board could just give a very brief summary of where the CPD regulations are right now and when they're going to be be coming back for a comment and the status of that. Thank you.
So at the November board meeting, the board reviewed and approved final draft language for the continued professional development regulations. And now staff is working on compiling the regulatory documents for submission in the initial review phase. So that's where we are at for continued professional development, and we will give another update at the May board meeting.
Thank you. All right, so seeing no further business in open session, we're going to go into closed session now. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in and for coming down here and giving your input.